He walked into that restaurant expecting an awkward evening with a stranger. What he found instead was the one woman who had the power to fire him, sitting across a candlelit table, staring back at him with the same look of pure disbelief. Ryan Carter had survived grief, loss, and years of silence, but nothing had prepared him for this. If you've ever had your carefully built world shaken in a single second, you need to stay until the very end, because this story is only getting started. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. You won't want to miss this one. The thing about routines is that people build them the way other people build walls, brick by careful brick, each one laid with intention, each one meant to keep something out. Ryan Carter understood this better than most. He had spent 4 years constructing his, and by the time he reached 32, the wall was solid enough that he almost believed nothing could get through it anymore. His alarm went off at 5:40 every morning, not 5:30, not 6. 5:40, because that gave him exactly 20 minutes before he needed to wake Lily, and those 20 minutes were his. Coffee, going in the kitchen, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the particular gray light that came through the window above the sink before the sun had fully committed to rising. He liked that light. It didn't ask anything of him. Lily was 7, and she woke up the way her mother used to, all at once, fully present, like sleep was just a room she'd stepped out of briefly and was now returning from with energy to spare. Some mornings that made him smile. Some mornings it gutted him in ways he still didn't have words for. He had learned to move through both kinds without showing the difference. He made her lunch while she ate breakfast. Turkey and cheese, the crust cut off because she hated crusts, an apple sliced into 8 pieces because she wouldn't eat it whole, a small bag of pretzels, a juice box, always the grape, never the fruit punch because she told him once that fruit punch tasted like cough medicine and she'd never let it go. He packed it in the blue lunchbox with the small yellow star on the front, the one she'd picked out herself at the start of the school year, and he zipped it closed the same way every morning, fingers moving without thought. Then he drove her to school, took the 7A on-ramp, and spent 45 minutes in traffic thinking about nothing in particular. This was his life. He'd chosen every piece of it deliberately. He worked as a safety supervisor at Whitmore Logistics, which operated out of a sprawling distribution facility on the eastern edge of the city. It wasn't the career he'd started in. He'd trained as a structural engineer, had spent 6 years doing the kind of work that mattered, inspecting load-bearing systems, reviewing industrial equipment, signing off on reports that other people's safety depended on. He'd been good at it, better than good. His supervisor at the time had told him he had instincts that couldn't be taught, that he read structural stress the way some people read faces. He didn't do that work anymore. The supervisor role at Whitmore was quieter, more contained. He reviewed safety protocols, walked the floor twice daily, filed reports, held monthly trainings with floor staff. It wasn't glamorous. The pay was decent, but not exceptional. His colleagues were fine, friendly enough, professional, the kind of people you'd eat lunch with, but not necessarily call on a Saturday. He didn't need more than that. He didn't want more than that. What he wanted was stability, predictability, a job where the stakes were manageable and the outcome of each day was something he could see coming. He had learned, the hard way, what happened when you trusted the other kind. Danny Marsh had been his friend since college, which meant Danny had earned the right to push in ways that other people couldn't. He was a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, twice divorced, perpetually optimistic in a way that Ryan had always found slightly exhausting and occasionally admirable. They met for beers every couple of weeks at a place near Danny's apartment, a bar called Hendrix that smelled like old wood and fryer oil and had a jukebox that nobody ever used. It was a Wednesday in October when Danny brought it up. "I want to set you up," Danny said, not looking up from his beer. Ryan set his glass down. "No." "You haven't heard anything yet." "I don't need to." "She's..." "Danny, just listen to me for 30 seconds. Danny finally looked up. There was something in his expression that wasn't his usual easy confidence, something more careful, like he'd rehearsed this. "You've been doing the same thing for 4 years, same job, same apartment, same Friday night with Lily watching whatever cartoon she's into. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But man, you're 32. You're not dead." Ryan looked at the table. The wood had a long scratch running diagonally across the surface, old and worn smooth. He traced it with his thumbnail. "Her name's Callie," Danny continued. "She works with my girlfriend. She's normal. That's the best thing I can say about her. She's a normal person who's been through some stuff and she's ready to meet someone. That's it. One dinner. If it's terrible, you go home and I never bring it up again. And if it's not terrible, then maybe your wall gets a window in it." Danny shrugged, picking up his beer. "Just a thought." Ryan didn't answer right away. He sat there with the noise of the bar moving around him, the low murmur of other conversations, a burst of laughter from the far corner, the muted sound of a game on the TV above the bar. He thought about Lily asking him 2 weeks ago if he ever got lonely. She'd asked it the way kids ask things, directly, without cruelty, just wanting to know. He'd told her he had her, hadn't he? She'd looked at him with those serious brown eyes and said, "That's not what I asked, Daddy. 7 years old." "One dinner," he said. Danny's face broke into a grin. "One dinner, Friday, 8 o'clock, place called Oleander on 5th. "Fine." Ryan picked up his beer. "If it's terrible, you're buying my drinks for a month." "Deal." "And Ryan," Danny paused, something shifting in his tone. "Just be a person for one night, okay? You know how to do that." Ryan didn't respond. He wasn't entirely sure that was still true. Oleander on 5th was the kind of restaurant that existed in a city's quieter register of wealth. Not flashy, not the kind of place you went to be seen, but precisely, intentionally good. Soft lighting, well-spaced tables, a wine list that required some knowledge to navigate. Ryan had looked it up online after Danny texted him the reservation details, and he'd spent a moment wondering if he still owned anything that didn't have a Whitmore Logistics logo on it. He found a gray button-down in the back of his closet, ironed it, wore it with dark slacks and the one pair of dress shoes he hadn't sold during the years when money was tighter. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for longer than he usually did, not entirely sure what he was looking for. He looked tired. He always looked a little tired. The gray at his temples had started a couple of years ago and had been expanding its territory steadily since. There were lines near his eyes that hadn't been there at 25. He was in decent shape. He walked the facility floor for miles each week, and he'd kept up a morning run for years more out of stubbornness than any real enthusiasm for it. But he was not the man he'd been before everything happened. He wasn't sure that man existed anymore. He kissed Lily goodnight. She was staying with his neighbor, Mrs. Albrecht, an older woman who had effectively become a surrogate grandmother to Lily over the past few years, and who had looked at Ryan with barely concealed delight when he'd mentioned he was going on a date. "Don't be nervous," Lily told him from the couch, already in her pajamas, a book open on her lap. "I'm not nervous," he said. She gave him a look that suggested she didn't entirely believe him. He took the long way to the restaurant. Tapus. He arrived 7 minutes early, which was habit, and gave his name to the host. The dining room was warm and unhurried, candlelight moving over white tablecloths, the low sound of a conversation from a nearby table. He followed the host toward the back of the room, already composing the version of himself he'd showed to a stranger. Polite, interested, careful not to say too much or too little. The host stopped at a corner table. Ryan looked up, and the ground shifted under him. It took his brain a full second to process what his eyes were already telling him, that the woman sitting at that table in a dark burgundy dress, her dark hair down around her shoulders, a glass of water raised halfway to her lips, was not a stranger named Callie from Danny's girlfriend's office. She was Sophia Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Logistics, his employer, the woman he had sat across from in 14 months of quarterly safety reviews, whose signature was on his employment contract, who he had walked through 3 facility expansions with, pointing out load tolerances and ventilation clearance requirements, while she asked questions with the particular precision of someone who didn't accept partial answers. Her hand stilled with the glass halfway to her mouth. He watched her recognize him. He watched the precise moment the polished composure she carried everywhere cracked open, just slightly, just for a second, and something purely human moved across her face. Surprise. Then something almost like embarrassment, then the very careful beginning of trying to figure out what expression to wear next. "Mr. Carter," she said. It came out more quietly than she'd probably intended. He stood there with his hands at his sides, aware of the host who was still present behind him, aware of the other diners at nearby tables who had no idea what was happening, aware of the entire absurdity of the moment pressing down on him like something physical. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. The host, apparently sensing something, quietly pulled out the chair across from her and disappeared. Ryan sat down. "Because what else did you do?" For a moment, neither of them said anything. The candle on the table between them burned steadily. The restaurant moved on around them, indifferent. From somewhere near the kitchen, a dish clattered against something and someone laughed. It was Sophia who spoke first. "Your friend's name is Danny Marsh," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah." He picked up the water glass in front of him, more to have something to do with his hands than out of any actual thirst. "Danny works with my—" He paused. "I've known him since college." "My friend Claire has been trying to set me up for about 3 months," Sophia said. She set her own glass down carefully. "She told me his name was Ryan, that he was dependable, that he had good instincts." A small beat. "She left out the part about where he worked." "She probably didn't know," Ryan said. "Danny doesn't— He knows I work at Whitmore, but he wouldn't have known who you were." Sophia nodded slowly. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, a gesture he recognized from meetings, controlled, deliberate. But her expression was doing something different, something he'd never seen in any meeting. She looked, underneath the composure, like she was trying very hard not to find this funny. "This is—" she started. "Yeah," he said. "Genuinely, I don't—" She pressed her lips together for a second. "I don't have a script for this." "That makes 2 of us." The waiter appeared, offered menus, went through the specials with the smooth efficiency of someone who had not the slightest idea what he'd walked into. Ryan ordered water. Sophia asked for a glass of wine. When the waiter left, they both looked at the menus for a moment, not reading them. "We can go," Ryan said. If it's easier. I can tell Danny it didn't work out, and you can tell your friend the same, and Monday morning we're just—" "Is that what you want?" She asked it plainly, looking up from her menu. He met her eyes. In conference rooms, he'd always found it easy to look at her directly. She was his employer, and there was a clear framework around that, a set of understood roles that made the interaction navigable. Now the framework was gone, and she was just a woman sitting across from him in a restaurant, and he was just a man who had no idea what he was doing. "I don't know," he said honestly. She seemed to appreciate that. The corners of her mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but the shape of one approaching. "Then let's order first," she said, "and figure out the rest after." He looked back at the menu. Something in his chest, which had been pulled tight since the moment he'd walked in, loosened slightly. Not much. Enough. "The salmon's good here," she said, not looking up from her own menu. "You've been here before?" "Board dinner, 4 months ago." She turned a page. "I spent the whole meal discussing freight lane optimization. The salmon was the best part of the evening." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It surprised him, the fact that something in him still knew how to do that. "Good to know," he said. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening. Inside, at a corner table under soft light, a single father who had spent 4 years building walls, and a billionaire CEO who had spent her whole life proving something looked at their menus and didn't say anything for a moment, and both quietly began to wonder what exactly they had walked into. The candle burned between them. Neither of them moved to leave. The salmon, as it turned out, was as good as advertised. Ryan hadn't expected to have an appetite. He'd driven to the restaurant in that particular state of low-grade anxiety that precedes any social situation you'd rather avoid, and after the moment of recognition at the table, appetite had seemed like something that belonged to a different evening entirely. But the food came, and they ate, and somewhere in the space between the first course and the second, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way he could have pointed to precisely, but the air between them stopped feeling like a held breath. They talked about safe things first, the way people do. Sophia asked about the commute from his side of the city, and he told her about the 7A backup that added 20 minutes most mornings, and she said she'd heard complaints about the interchange at Reiser Avenue from half her logistics team. He asked how long she'd been coming to Oleander, and she told him about the board dinners, the quarterly habit that had started 3 years ago when her CFO had declared it neutral ground, far enough from the office that people talked differently, close enough that no one had an excuse to skip it. She said it with a slight dryness that made it clear she found the idea of neutral ground slightly absurd. "You don't think it works?" he asked. "I think people are the same people wherever you put them," she said. "The tablecloth doesn't change much." It was a small thing, but it was the first time she'd said something unguarded, something that wasn't careful, and Ryan noticed it the way you notice a window opening in a room that's been closed too long. The waiter refilled her wine. She hadn't asked for a second glass, but she didn't send it back either. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." She set down her fork. "Why safety supervision?" He looked at her. The question was direct in the way her questions always were. In meetings, she had a habit of cutting past the preamble and going straight to the things she actually wanted to know, which some people found unsettling and which Ryan had always, privately, respected. But this was different from a meeting. There was no agenda here. She was asking because she wanted to know. "It's a long answer," he said. "We have time." He picked up his water glass, set it down. He told the outline of the story before, to HR during his hiring process, to Danny once, years ago, to the one therapist he'd seen for 4 months after everything happened before he decided he was managing well enough on his own. Each time he told it, he found a slightly shorter version, a version with fewer edges. He didn't use the short version now. He wasn't sure why. "I was a structural engineer," he said, "before. Did 6 years of it, mostly industrial side, manufacturing plants, distribution facilities, some bridge work early on. I was good at it." He paused. That wasn't arrogance. It was just accurate. "I had a supervisor who used to say I could read a structure the way other people read faces. Load stress, metal fatigue, the places where something wants to fail before it actually does." Sophia was watching him steadily, not with the polished attention she performed in meetings, the kind of listening that's really just waiting, but something quieter than that, actually listening. "There was a facility," he continued, "industrial grain processing plant, about 200 miles north. I was the lead engineer on a routine inspection. I found problems. A conveyor support structure that had fatigue cracking in 3 load-bearing points, way beyond what the maintenance schedule had caught. I flagged it, filed a full report, recommended immediate shutdown for repair." He stopped for a moment. The restaurant moved around them, unhurried. The plant manager buried the report. The company that owned the facility didn't want the downtime. They had contracts, delivery windows, the usual. My supervisor at the firm got pressure from the client, and the pressure came back down to me in the form of a revised report that said the structure was within acceptable tolerances. He looked at the table. "I signed it. Not the original. They used a version I'd never seen. Put my name on language I hadn't written." Sophia didn't say anything. There was something in her face that wasn't pity and wasn't judgment, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. 6 weeks later, the conveyor structure failed during a full production run, he said. 4 workers injured, 1 killed. He kept his voice even because he'd learned how to do that. "My wife was touring the facility that day. She was a compliance auditor, used to visit sites all over the region. She wasn't anywhere near the failure point, but the secondary collapse from the structure coming down, a section of overhead catwalk." He stopped. "She didn't make it to the hospital. The candle between them burned without wavering. I tried to fight it afterward," he said. "The falsified report, the pressure campaign. I had records of what I'd actually filed, emails, timestamps. The company's lawyers were better than anything I could afford, and my firm distanced themselves immediately." He shook his head, slowly. "I got a settlement that barely covered the legal fees. My name was cleared officially, but the industry is small. Everyone knew. And I didn't—" He paused, looking for the right words and finding something honest instead. "I didn't want to do that work anymore. I didn't trust the system I'd been part of, so I stopped." "And you came to Whitmore," Sophia said, 3 years later. "Spent time in between doing odd jobs, trying to figure out how to be a single father to a 4-year-old. He exhaled. "The safety supervisor role made sense. Smaller scope, direct oversight. If I saw something wrong, I could do something about it without going through 4 layers of corporate approval and a client relationship management team." He said the last part with a slight edge, and then heard it and glanced up. She didn't look offended. She looked like someone turning something over carefully in their mind. "I knew your work was thorough," she said. "The floor teams respect you. That's not easy to earn there. They've had 3 supervisors in 5 years who didn't last." She paused. "I didn't know any of the rest. It's not something I put in a work context." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A small quiet settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that happens when something real has been said, and there's no need to rush past it. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife. About all of it." "Thank you." He said it simply because it was simple. He'd learned to accept condolences without deflecting them, which had taken longer than he expected. She picked up her wine glass, then set it back down without drinking. "Can I tell you something in return?" "Yeah." She smoothed the edge of the tablecloth near her plate, a small, slightly nervous gesture that was so unlike her boardroom posture that it caught him off guard. "Most people who meet me meet the CEO first, the Whitmore name, the Forbes profile, the company valuation." She said it without any self-congratulation. If anything, there was a tiredness under it. "My father started this company. He built it from a regional carrier into what it is now over 30 years. He retired 8 years ago and handed it to me, which the board accepted because they had no other option, and because the performance numbers supported it." She looked at the table. "But there's been a version of this story people tell, that I inherited it, that I'm a caretaker, that the name on the door is doing most of the work." "I've never heard anyone say that," Ryan said. She looked at him. "You're being polite." "I'm really not." He met her eyes directly. "I've been in 20-plus meetings with you. I've watched you question a maintenance proposal that 3 senior operations managers had already signed off on because you noticed a discrepancy in the load cycle data. I've seen you shut down a vendor relationship worth about $8 million annually because their compliance documentation didn't hold up under review." He paused. "Nobody who just inherited a name does any of that." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but something that had been held carefully behind composure moved slightly to one side. "The board still watches me differently than they'd watch a male CEO with the same record," she said. "I've accepted that. But accepting it doesn't mean it stops mattering." She tilted her head slightly. "I've spent 8 years making decisions I believe in, and sometimes wondering if the people around me are following my leadership or my last name." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." She said it plainly, without drama. "Most days I don't think about it, but it's there." Ryan considered that. He thought about what it cost to carry a thing quietly for years. Not to perform strength, exactly, but to simply not put the weight down because there wasn't anywhere safe to set it. He knew something about that. "Does it change the decisions you make?" he asked. "Knowing people are watching differently?" She thought about it. "It makes me more precise," she said. "I document more than I need to. I ask one more question than necessary in every meeting. I never let a number pass me without running it myself." A small pause. "Whether that's strength or anxiety, I genuinely couldn't tell you." He found himself leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table. In all the months of working with her, he had never sat across from her like this. Without an agenda between them, without reports or floor diagrams or quarterly metrics acting as the scaffolding of their interaction. He had built a professional impression of her that was accurate as far as it went. Sharp, demanding, fair, occasionally intimidating in the way that competent people are when they don't perform patience they don't feel. But this person, the one who smoothed tablecloths and said I genuinely couldn't tell you, was someone else. Or rather, was the same person with the professional surface rubbed away. "For what it's worth," he said, "you're one of 3 executives I've worked for who actually reads the safety reports." She raised an eyebrow. "Only 3. Out of 9. And one of those 3 was me, technically, so—" She laughed. It was brief and unguarded, and nothing like the polite acknowledgement she performed when someone said something mildly amusing in a board presentation. It was a real laugh, slightly surprised, and it transformed her face in a way that Ryan registered without knowing what to do with. The waiter appeared and offered dessert menus. Neither of them ordered dessert. They asked for coffee. The evening had gone sideways in the best possible way, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so directly. which was probably for the best. The coffee came and went. The restaurant had thinned around them. The tables nearest them had emptied, and the ambient noise had dropped to a lower register. Ryan noticed dimly that they had been sitting there for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He noticed this the way you notice a detail that should mean something but doesn't feel pressing enough to act on. They had moved by then from the careful territory of backstory into something looser, the kind of conversation that happens when the formal architecture has been stripped away and you're just talking, following threads wherever they lead. He told her about Lily's current obsession with marine biology, about the 3 library books currently living on their kitchen table that were all specifically about deep-sea creatures, and the way Lily had informed him with complete seriousness that the barrel-eye fish was underrated. Sophia had laughed at that, actually laughed, the same unguarded way as before, and said she'd had a phase at that age where she'd wanted to be an oceanographer, and her father had told her there was no money in it, and she'd spent 2 weeks furious at him. Was he right? Ryan asked. Completely, she said, which I didn't appreciate until I was about 25, and didn't say out loud until I was 30. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He was also wrong in the way that matters more, which is that I could have found my way to something else I loved and been fine. He didn't believe that. A small pause. He believed in contingency plans more than he believed in people. Is that why you took over the company? She was quiet for a moment. I took over the company because I was the most qualified person for it, and I knew it, and saying that out loud makes me sound like an egotist, but it's the truth. She looked at him levelly. I also took it because I wanted to prove I was more than the plan he made for me. Those 2 things can both be true. Yeah, Ryan said. They can. She looked at him steadily. You're easier to talk to than I expected. What did you expect? She considered that. In the facility, you're very contained, professional. You say what needs to be said and you don't elaborate past it. I assumed that was just the full picture. It mostly is, he said, in that context. But not in this one. Not tonight. He looked at his coffee. I don't know what tonight is, honestly. That makes 2 of us. She said it without apparent anxiety, which he appreciated. I think it might be the first genuinely unplanned thing I've done in about 4 years. How's it feel? She tilted her head slightly, as if actually taking the question seriously rather than deflecting it. Strange, she said. Not bad strange. Just, she searched for the word. Unfamiliar. Outside, it had started to rain. Ryan could see it through the front windows of the restaurant. A light, steady rain that made the streetlights smear across the wet pavement in long orange lines. He thought about his umbrella, which was in his car, which was not helpful. He thought about Lily, asleep at Mrs. Albrecht's apartment, about the gray morning that was coming, about the Whitmore facility and the weekly safety review he had scheduled for Monday, and the stack of maintenance logs on his desk that needed cross-referencing. He thought about how, in approximately 54 hours, he was going to have to sit across from this woman in a conference room and discuss ventilation compliance standards. This is going to be complicated, he said. Yes? She didn't pretend otherwise. It is. I'm not saying that like it's a problem, he said. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think we're both thinking it. I've been thinking it since approximately the moment you sat down, she said, but I also thought about leaving, and I didn't, so... She set down her coffee cup. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't have a framework for this particular situation. Me neither. What I know, she said carefully, is that the last 2 hours have been the first time in a long time that I've talked to someone without managing what I was saying. She looked at the table, then back up at him. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I know it's worth something. Ryan sat with that for a moment. He thought about Danny, who would probably be insufferably smug about this. He thought about the wall he'd built, brick by careful brick, and about Lily asking him if he ever got lonely, and about the way he'd answered her without answering her. He thought about how you could be careful for so long that the carefulness started to feel like the point of the whole thing. I'm not going to pretend I know where this goes, he said. I don't have any idea. Neither do I. But He stopped, found the honest version. I'm glad it wasn't Callie from your friend's office. Something warm moved across her face. So am I. A beat. For the record, outside the rain picked up slightly. Inside, the waiter brought the check without being asked, which was the kind of diplomatic judgment that deserved a generous tip. Ryan reached for it automatically. Sophia looked like she was going to object and then seemed to decide against it. "Next time," she said. "I'll get it." He looked up from the check. "That's making an assumption." "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "It is." He paid. They put on their coats. His was a plain dark wool thing that had seen better years. Hers was a structured charcoal coat that probably cost more than his monthly car payment, and it looked like what it was. They walked out into the rain together, stopping under the awning at the restaurant's entrance. The street was quiet, the rain soft and consistent. "My car's around the block," he said. "Mine's in the garage across the street." She glanced up at the rain. "No umbrella." "Neither." They stood there for a moment, which was slightly ridiculous because it was just rain, but there was something about the threshold they were standing on. The edge of the evening, the point where it ended and the next thing began, that neither of them seemed to be in a hurry to cross. "Monday morning," she said. "Monday morning," he agreed. The conference room, the ventilation report, the 4 other people around the table who wouldn't know anything. "We figure it out as we go," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "You okay with that? You don't seem like someone who usually operates that way." She gave him a look that was halfway between rueful and amused. "No," she said, "I really don't." A small pause. "That might be exactly why." She stepped out from under the awning and walked into the rain without hurrying, crossing toward the parking garage with her coat collar turned up and her head down. She didn't look back. That was somehow very much like her. Ryan stood there for another moment, rain blurring the streetlights, the city moving quietly around him. Then he turned and walked to his car, hands in his pockets, not minding the rain particularly. He drove home thinking about structural fault lines, the kind you can't see from the surface, the ones that only show under pressure, the kind that can bring something down without warning, or, if you find them in time, can tell you exactly where the thing is most alive. He pulled into his parking spot and sat in the car for a minute, engine off. He thought, be a person for one night. He thought he might have managed it. He got out of the car and went upstairs, and when he checked his phone before bed, there was a text from a number he didn't have saved. Just 4 words. The salmon was good. He stared at it for a moment. Then he typed back, "Told you." He put the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a long time before he fell asleep. Okay. Monday came the way Mondays always did. Gray and indifferent, traffic on the 7A, coffee going in the kitchen at 5:40, while the city outside the window pulled itself slowly toward morning. Lily had wanted blueberry jam on her toast instead of the usual peanut butter, which required a brief negotiation about whether they actually had blueberry jam, which they didn't, and then a longer negotiation about whether the strawberry preserves at the back of the shelf were an acceptable substitute, which they were, eventually. She left for school with a slightly sticky chin and her backpack listing to the left the way it always did when she packed her own books, and Ryan drove to the facility on autopilot, his mind running the Monday logistics in the background while another part of him tracked the particular strangeness of knowing what the morning held. He arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled review, got coffee from the machine in the break room. Bad coffee, always, the ground slightly over-extracted, but hot, and took the long way to the 3rd-floor conference room, walking the facility floor as he always did on Mondays, checking the overnight shift handoff, making note of a spill report near Base 7 that hadn't been fully documented, stopping to talk to Eddie Reyes on the loading dock about a forklift operator certification renewal that was coming due. He was good at this. The floor felt normal. His notes were building the way they always did in his head, methodical, useful. He walked into the conference room at 8:57, and there were already 3 people at the table: Tom Garfield from operations, Michelle Park from facilities, and Carl Brandt, the regional operations manager who had a habit of arriving first to everything and positioning himself at the seat nearest the door. Ryan nodded to all 3, set down his folder, and poured a cup of the conference room coffee, which was marginally better than the break room version and still not worth discussing. At 9:01, Sophia walked in. She was wearing a dark blazer over a white blouse, her hair up, a tablet under her arm, and a coffee cup in her hand that she'd clearly brought from somewhere that wasn't the conference room machine. She said good morning to the room generally, set her things down at the head of the table, and glanced at Ryan exactly as long as she glanced at Tom Garfield and Michelle Park and Carl Brandt, which was briefly and professionally and with no particular significance. He kept his own expression exactly as it always was. "Let's get started," she said. "Ryan, you want to walk us through the overnight reports first?" "Sure." He opened his folder. Bay 7 had an undocumented spill on the B-level floor. I flagged it for a full incident form. The overhead lighting in corridor C4 is down to one functioning unit. Maintenance has the work order. Forklift certification renewals, 3 operators coming due in the next 30 days. I've got the scheduling request drafted. He glanced up. And the quarterly equipment inspection for the yard cranes is scheduled for next Thursday. I'd recommend we have an outside engineering review on the number 2 unit specifically. There were some unusual load readings in last month's data that I want a second set of eyes on. He said the last part the same way he said everything else. Flat, professional, grounded in specifics. Sophia made a note on her tablet. "Flag it for external review. Agreed. What's the lead time on getting someone out here?" "I can have names by Wednesday." "Good." She moved on. "Tom, facilities budget review." The meeting moved. Ryan participated where he needed to, let the silence do its work where he didn't. At the other end of the table, Carl Brandt said things that were mostly about protecting the operations timeline, and occasionally about budget, which was his consistent position on every subject. Michelle Park asked 2 good questions about the C4 corridor lighting timeline, and whether the spill incident had any implications for the floor inspection schedule coming up. At no point did the meeting resemble anything other than exactly what it was. 40 minutes in, they wrapped. People gathered their things and filtered out. Ryan was closing his folder when he heard Sophia say quietly, "Give me 1 second." And when he looked up, the room was empty except for the 2 of them. She was still at the head of the table, tablet in hand, and she had the expression she wore when she was about to say something direct that she'd been holding for a few minutes. "The number 2 crane," she said. "Yeah. That's the unit Marcus Vale's team approved for the Harrington contract runs." Ryan kept his face neutral. Marcus Vale was the VP of Regional Operations, above Carl Brandt, below Sophia, and the kind of executive who occupied meetings with the particular authority of someone who had learned that authority is partly performance. Ryan had dealt with him twice directly, once about a safety protocol modification that Marcus had wanted expedited, and once about a maintenance schedule that Marcus had suggested Ryan was being overly conservative about. Both conversations had ended with Ryan holding his position and Marcus looking at him with a specific kind of smile that wasn't a smile. "I know," Ryan said. "That's why I want the external review." "He's going to push back." She said it matter-of-factly, not as a warning, just as information. "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll back the review," she said. "Put it in writing so there's a record." "Already planned to." She nodded once, the way she nodded at decisions she agreed with, and picked up her coffee cup. The meeting was over. She walked toward the door, then stopped without turning around. "The strawberry preserves," she said. "Are they a good substitute?" He blinked. "What?" She glanced back over her shoulder, and the edge of something that wasn't entirely professional moved across her face for just a second. "You told me about the blueberry jam situation, in a text, Saturday morning." He had in fact texted her a brief and slightly absurd update about the jam negotiation, which in retrospect he couldn't fully explain except that it had seemed funny in the moment, and she had responded with a single question mark that somehow conveyed both confusion and amusement simultaneously. "Good enough," he said. She ate it. "High praise," she said, and then she was gone, and Ryan stood in the empty conference room for a moment, looking at the place where she'd been, thinking about load readings and external reviews and the particular complexity of a situation that had no framework and no precedent and was moving, regardless of any of that, steadily forward. He picked up his folder and his bad coffee. He had a floor to walk. The external engineering firm Ryan had requested sent a man named Gregor Hassa, mid-50s, compact, the kind of engineer who wore the same expression whether he was looking at a spreadsheet or a structural failure, which was useful because his expressions told you nothing and his reports told you everything. He arrived on Thursday morning with a clipboard and a measuring device that Ryan recognized from his own previous life and walked the yard crane perimeter without speaking for 20 minutes, while Ryan followed at a respectful distance. Ryan had learned years ago that you didn't rush a good inspector. You let them look at what they needed to look at, in the order they needed to look at it, without filling the silence with your own interpretation. The silence was where the actual work happened. Gregor crouched at the base of the number 2 crane's mast assembly and looked at something near the lower bearing housing for a long time. Then he stood up and made a note without comment. "When was the last full load cycle test on this unit?" he asked. Not to Ryan specifically, to the air, the way experienced people sometimes ask questions when they already have a sense of what the answer is going to be. Ryan checked his folder. Documented test was 14 months ago. The maintenance log shows a partial inspection 8 months ago, but the sign-off is... He paused, looking at the paperwork. It's signed by a floor crew lead, not a certified inspector. Gregor looked at the log Ryan handed him. His expression didn't change. "And this unit's been running full operational load since then?" "Yes, daily, on the Harrington contract runs." Gregor handed the log back. "I'll need the full operational data from the last 12 months. Load weights, cycle frequency, any anomalies flagged by the operators." "I can have that pulled today." "Good." Gregor looked back at the crane. "I'm not going to tell you this is fine because I don't know yet whether it's fine. What I will tell you is that the wear pattern on the lower bearing housing is not consistent with the maintenance record they've been keeping. That was engineer language for something is wrong, and someone should have noticed. Ryan wrote it down. I'll get you everything you need." He walked back to the building with the particular feeling he'd learned to trust over years. Not alarm exactly, but a heightened alertness that lived in his chest and behind his eyes and was his nervous system's way of saying, "Pay attention." He'd ignored that feeling once. He didn't plan to again. The data pull took most of Thursday afternoon. Ryan sat at his desk with 3 years of operational logs and the load cycle records from the Harrington contract and a cup of coffee that went cold an hour in, and he cross-referenced numbers with the methodical focus that had made him good at his original job and that he hadn't fully deployed in years. There was something almost physical about it, like a muscle he'd kept deliberately underused, suddenly bearing weight again. What he found was not dramatic on its face. That was how these things usually worked. It was never one catastrophic number. It was a pattern of smaller ones, each defensible in isolation, each consistent with someone making a low-stakes choice to defer a cost. The load cycle readings were running consistently above the manufacturer's recommended operational threshold, not by a large margin, but persistently, without the expected rest periods built into the schedule. The partial inspection 8 months ago had flagged 2 items for follow-up that showed no subsequent documentation, and the sign-off on the most recent maintenance approval had been expedited. Ryan could see it in the timestamps, 3 days ahead of when the inspection period should have closed. Somebody had been moving things through faster than they should. He sat with the printouts spread across his desk and thought about the Harrington contract, which he knew was substantial. A regional distribution deal that accounted for a meaningful portion of the facility's quarterly throughput. He thought about the board meeting that was coming up in 3 weeks, which Carl Brandt had mentioned twice in passing in the past month, and which Marcus Vale had referenced in a different context in the hallway outside the third-floor kitchen. Board meetings required good numbers. Good numbers required on-time delivery. On-time delivery required the cranes to keep running. He thought about a plant manager who'd buried a structural report 14 months before a conveyor system failed. He stacked the printouts into a folder. Then he thought for a moment and made a second copy, which he put in his bag. He was reaching for his phone to call Sophia's office when his door opened without a knock. Marcus Vale had a way of entering rooms that suggested he considered knocking a courtesy he extended selectively. He was tall, well-dressed in the particular way of men who understood that appearance was a professional tool, with a broad face and pale eyes and the specific confidence of someone who had spent 20 years being the smartest person in most of the rooms he entered. He might have been the smartest person in those rooms. Ryan had never been able to determine whether Marcus was genuinely sharp or simply aggressive in a way that produced similar results. He stood in Ryan's doorway looking at the printouts on the desk with the expression of a man who had been watching from a distance and decided the distance was no longer useful. "Gregor Hassa was on the yard this morning," Marcus said. "That's right." Ryan didn't move the printouts. "External review on the number 2 crane. Ms. Whitmore approved it Monday." Marcus stepped into the office, not invited, but not dramatically uninvited. He stopped near the desk and looked at the paperwork the way people look at things they're trying to assess without appearing to assess them. "I've seen Gregor's work before. He's thorough." The word thorough landed with a specific weight that suggested thorough was not necessarily a compliment. "The number 2 unit is carrying the Harrington runs through the end of next month. You know that." "I do." "A full shutdown for inspection would set us back 12 to 15 days minimum." "Probably," Ryan agreed. "The board meeting is in 3 weeks. Ryan looked at him. "I know when the board meeting is, Marcus." The two of them held that for a moment. In the facility's particular social ecosystem, Marcus occupied a tier significantly above Ryan's. Different budget authority, different access, different weight when he walked into a room. Ryan was aware of this the way you're aware of the specific topology of a place you've worked for a while. It was just information. "What exactly are you flagging?" Marcus asked. He said it with the tone of a man who has decided to be direct, which meant he'd decided direct was the best strategy available. "Inconsistencies in the maintenance record," Ryan said. "Load readings above threshold on a unit without a certified full inspection in 14 months. A follow-up item from 8 months ago that was never closed out. Operational variance within acceptable tolerances. Gregor doesn't think the wear pattern matches the maintenance record." Marcus's expression shifted. Not much, just at the edges. "Gregor hasn't filed his report yet." "No," Ryan said. "He hasn't." "Then we're speculating." "I'm not speculating. I'm looking at the data in front of me and comparing it to the maintenance documentation and noting the discrepancies." Ryan kept his voice even. He was very good at keeping his voice even. "That's my job." "Your job is safety supervision, which is a floor-level function." Marcus said it without hostility, which made it more effective as a statement of hierarchy. "Engineering analysis of equipment specifications is a different scope." "My background is structural engineering," Ryan said. "I think you know that." "Your background is your background. Your role here is defined differently." Ryan looked at him for a moment. "If the crane fails under load, Marcus, my background doesn't change the outcome." Something flickered in Marcus's face. Too fast to identify, there and gone. He put both hands in his jacket pockets, which was a relaxed posture that Ryan recognized as performed. "I'm not telling you not to do your job," he said. "I'm telling you to consider the context. The Harrington contract has senior leadership support. The board meeting timeline is a business reality. You flag a problem, we address it through proper channels with appropriate scheduling." He paused. "That's the professional way to handle it, not an external reviewer walking the yard unannounced." "The review was approved and scheduled," Ryan said. "It was in writing. Nobody was unannounced." Marcus looked at him with that particular smile that wasn't a smile. "Right." He moved toward the door. "I'll want to see Gregor's report before it goes upstairs." Ryan said nothing. Marcus left. He didn't close the door behind him. Ryan sat for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Sophia's office. Her assistant put him through in under 2 minutes, which was faster than usual. "I need time today," he said when she picked up. "Not a meeting, just time." A brief pause. 6 o'clock. The small conference room on 4. "I'll be there." He hung up and looked at the folder of printouts on his desk. Then he looked at the copy in his bag. Then he looked at the door Marcus hadn't bothered to close. He got up and closed it himself. Now, the 4th floor small conference room was the one Sophia used when she didn't want whatever was happening to appear on the official room booking system. Ryan had figured this out around the 3rd time she'd used the specific phrase small conference room on 4 as opposed to the conference room or any of the named rooms on the schedule. It was a habit of hers, separating the things that needed official context from the things that needed actual conversation. He was there at 5:55. She arrived at 6:02, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow the way she got when she was done performing the formalities of the day. She closed the door, didn't sit down immediately, and looked at the folder he'd put on the table. "Show me," she said. He walked her through it. Not the way he would have walked a board through it, not framed, not structured for persuasion, just the data in sequence, what it showed, what it didn't show, what Gregor had said about the wear pattern. She stood at the table and looked at the printouts and asked questions the way she always asked questions, which was directly and with specificity and without any of the softening people sometimes put around information they don't want to be true. "The follow-up from 8 months ago," she said. "The 2 flagged items that were never closed. Who signed the maintenance approval that went through anyway?" Ryan pointed to the document. "Crew lead named Pete Sorensen. The approval went up through Carl Brandt's office." She looked at the timestamp. "This was expedited. By 3 days." She set the document down. "And Marcus came to see you today." It wasn't a question. Ryan had mentioned it in the single text he'd sent her before 6 p.m. "Vale visited my office this afternoon." And she'd read it because her response had been a single period, which had become their shorthand for understood, noted, "we'll talk." "He wants to see Gregor's report before it comes to you," Ryan said. "Of course he does." She said it without heat, which was more concerning than if she'd said it with heat. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. That the review was approved and documented, that I was doing my job." She looked at him. "How bad is it? Your honest read." He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about the wear pattern, the load thresholds, the incomplete follow-up, the expedited approval. He thought about the conveyor support structure 14 months before a collapse, and the way the numbers had looked defensible in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. "The crane isn't going to fail tomorrow," he said carefully. "I don't know that, but the conditions that precede a structural failure under repeated load stress. The pattern looks familiar to me in ways I don't like." He paused. "If Gregor's report says what I think it's going to say, I think the number 2 unit needs to come offline until we have a certified full inspection, and whatever repairs that inspection identifies, which is 15 days minimum, possibly more." She was quiet for a moment. She had a way of going quiet that wasn't checked out. It was the opposite, actually, a focused kind of silence, where you could almost see her running the variables. He'd noticed it in meetings. He noticed it now in the small, underfurnished conference room with the city going dark outside the window. "The Harrington contract has penalty clauses for delay," she said. "I know that because I signed the contract." "I know. A 15-day minimum shutdown this close to the board meeting is going to be—" She stopped. "It's going to create pressure." "Yes. Marcus is going to use that pressure. He's already starting to." She looked at the printouts on the table. Then she looked at him. "What do you need from me?" He thought about this on the drive over. "I need you to get Gregor's report directly. Not through Marcus's office, not through operations, directly to you and directly to me, simultaneously. And I need the operational logs for the past 3 years formally preserved. Not just the folder I have, officially logged, time-stamped, non-modifiable." "You think someone might alter them?" "I think that when there's pressure and there's a discrepancy, and there's someone who has been making decisions that the discrepancy doesn't flatter, I think you preserve the record." He paused. "I learned that the hard way." She held his gaze for a moment. She knew the story. He'd told her at the restaurant, the falsified report, his name on language he hadn't written. She didn't bring it up directly, she just nodded. "I'll have legal lock the operational files tonight," she said. "I'll contact Gregor directly in the morning." She picked up one of the printouts and looked at it again. "Ryan, if this is what you think it is, if someone has been deliberately managing these approvals to protect the Harrington timeline, then we have a problem that's bigger than a crane inspection." "Yes." She set the document down. "We do." What? Gregor's report arrived Friday afternoon. It was 11 pages, methodical, written in the dry technical language of someone who understood that plainness was its own form of authority. Ryan read it at his desk and then read it again, and when he finished the second reading, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk and breathed carefully through his nose. The lower bearing housing showed fatigue cracking consistent with chronic overload cycling. The crack propagation pattern suggested the damage had been developing for a minimum of 8 to 10 months. The two items flagged in the partial inspection 8 months ago, and never closed out, were directly related to the cracking Gregor had now documented in full. In Gregor's assessment, continued operation of the unit under current load conditions carried a meaningful risk of catastrophic failure of the mast assembly, most likely under peak load during a full lift cycle. Ryan knew what peak load during a full lift cycle looked like at the Whitmore yard. He'd watched it dozens of times. The crane at full extension, 30-plus tons of containerized freight suspended at height. The crew on the ground below working the staging area. The forklift operators moving in the corridor between the dock and the yard. He was dialing Sophia before he finished the thought. "I've read it," she said when she picked up. Her voice was flat and controlled in the way that meant she was holding something tightly. "I want the number 2 unit offline by end of day. I'm signing the shutdown order now. Marcus is going to—" "I know what Marcus is going to do." A pause. "I need you to send me the full data package. Everything you have. The logs, the maintenance records, the expedited approval, the flagged follow-up items, Gregor's report. All of it. Already compiled. Sending now." "Good." Another pause, shorter. "Ryan." "Yeah. You were right to push on this." He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't really anything to say. He sent the package. Then he walked down to the operations floor to personally confirm that the shutdown order had reached the yard supervisor on duty, because he had learned not to assume that a digital order necessarily translated to a physical action without a human being verifying the chain. The yard supervisor, a steady woman named Carla Torres, who had been running that floor for 11 years, looked at the order on her tablet and then looked at Ryan with the expression of someone who had suspected something was off and was now having the suspicion confirmed. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. She nodded once. "I'll pull the crew off it now." "Thank you, Carla." He was walking back toward the building when his phone buzzed. Marcus Vale. He let it go to voicemail. Then he listened to the voicemail, which was calm and professional, and said, in essence, that the shutdown order had been flagged to Marcus's attention and that he wanted to discuss the operational implications before it was finalized, and that Ryan should call him back at his earliest convenience. Ryan deleted the voicemail and kept walking. What happened next took place over the weekend, which was not when Ryan expected it to happen, but which, in retrospect, made complete sense. A weekend, when the building was quieter and the oversight was thinner, and a man who had spent 20 years learning how organizations actually operated would know exactly which gaps to move through. Ryan got the call Saturday morning at 7:15. He was in the kitchen making Lily's breakfast. She'd accepted the strawberry preserves again, progress, when his phone lit up with a number he recognized as the facility's main operations line. It was Pete Sorensen, the crew lead whose name was on the expedited maintenance approval. Ryan had never spoken to Pete Sorensen directly. He knew him by name from the documentation, had seen him on the floor, but they'd had no direct interaction. The voice on the phone was a man in his late 40s, who sounded like he hadn't slept well, which was confirmed when Pete said, without preamble, "I need to talk to someone, about the number 2 crane, about what's been going on." Ryan set down the butter knife. "Okay," he said, "tell me." What Pete told him took 45 minutes, and Ryan sat at his kitchen table and listened and wrote things down on a legal pad while Lily ate her toast in the living room with a marine biology book open on her lap, occasionally yelling out facts about anglerfish that Ryan acknowledged with the automatic parental response of, "That's interesting, bud," while his hand moved steadily across the page. Pete had been a crew lead at Whitmore for 9 years. For the past 3, he'd been receiving what he described as pressure from Carl Brandt's operations team to sign off on inspections ahead of schedule when the Harrington contract runs were in peak periods. The pressure wasn't explicit. It never was, Pete said, which was how these things worked. It was framed as streamlining, as trusting the crew's judgment, as not creating unnecessary delays in a tight logistics window. The 2 flagged items from 8 months ago had been ones Pete had genuinely flagged. He'd noted the anomalies in the bearing housing and had expected them to be followed up by a certified inspection team. Instead, Carl Brandt's office had called him and asked him to close the items as within tolerance to keep the approval moving. I said I wasn't comfortable with that, Pete said, and Carl said that wasn't what he was asking me to decide, that the engineering team had reviewed it. Pete was quiet for a moment. I don't know if they did. I assumed they did. I signed because I assumed. Ryan looked at his legal pad. Has this happened before? Other equipment, other timelines? 3 times that I can document, Pete said. I kept records. Not because I was planning to do anything, so I just kept them. Habit. He paused. When the shutdown order came through yesterday, I figured someone had finally caught up. And then last night, Carl called me and told me the decision was under review and that I should be available Monday for a conversation about the maintenance approval. That was the moment Ryan understood what was happening. The shutdown order that Sophia had signed was being positioned as something to be reviewed rather than implemented. Someone in the operational chain between Sophia's order and the physical crane in the yard was creating friction. Pete, Ryan said carefully, the records you kept, are they at the facility or somewhere else? My personal email. I've been forwarding things to myself for about a year. A pause. Is that a problem? No, Ryan said. That's the opposite of a problem. Don't delete anything. Don't discuss this with anyone from Carl's team or Marcus Vale's team until you hear from me or from Miss Whitmore directly. Can you do that? Yeah. Pete sounded steadier than when the call had started. Yeah, I can do that. Ryan hung up and looked at what he'd written on the legal pad. Then he looked at Lily, who had abandoned the anglerfish facts in favor of drawing something in her sketchbook, curled up in the corner of the couch with her knees tucked under her. He thought about the number 2 crane sitting in the yard. He thought about the shutdown order. He thought about Carl Brandt's phone call to Pete Sorensen on a Friday night. He picked up his phone and called Sophia. She answered on the second ring. The shutdown order, he said. Is it implemented? Physically? Is the unit actually offline? A pause that lasted 1 second too long. I'm checking right now. He heard her typing, then a brief silence. The order is in the system as pending operational review. Pending review. He kept his voice level. Who authorized that status? More typing. It's flagged under Marcus Vale's override authority. Her voice was very controlled now, which meant what it always meant. She was holding something tightly enough that it wasn't showing. He has operational override on contract critical equipment decisions pending board-level review. Sophia, Ryan stood up from the table. The crane is still running. He said it plainly, the way he said things that needed to be understood without interpretation. The crane is still running. 30 tons of freight suspended daily over a cracking mast assembly, a bearing housing with documented fatigue damage, a follow-up inspection that was never completed, and a man who had spent his career learning to read what structures looked like before they failed was telling her plainly, the crane is still running. The silence on her end lasted 3 seconds. I'm coming to the facility, she said. I'll meet you there. He looked at Lily, who had looked up from her drawing and was watching him with the particular attention of a 7-year-old who had learned to read the temperature of a room from her father's posture. I have to go to work for a little while, he said. I'm going to call Mrs. Albrecht. Lily looked at him. Is something wrong? He crossed to the couch and sat next to her, the legal pad in his hand. He thought about what to say. He didn't lie to her about things that mattered, which had been a policy he'd established after the first year, when he tried to protect her from every difficult thing and found that she noticed the protection and found it frightening in its own way. There might be, he said. I have to go make sure something is safe. That's my job. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to things. Okay, she said finally. Can you be home for dinner? I'll try hard, he said. That's the best I can give you right now. Okay. She went back to her drawing. Then, without looking up, be careful, Daddy. He put on his jacket. He put the legal pad in his bag next to the folder of printouts. He called Mrs. Albrecht, who said, of course, bring her over, take as long as he needed. He drove to the facility through a Saturday morning that was ordinary in every surface way. Light traffic, gray sky, a delivery truck on Reiser Avenue, the city doing its weekend thing without urgency. He parked and walked to the yard and looked at the number 2 crane from a distance. It was running. A full load cycle, a shipping container suspended 40 feet up, the mast under tension. He stood there and watched it, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite fear. Fear had a quality of uncertainty, and this was the opposite. This was the terrible clarity of knowing exactly what you were looking at, and what it meant and what happened when the people who should have listened to it didn't. He pulled out his phone and started documenting. Photos of the crane in operation, time-stamped. The operational log on the yard tablet, showing the override status. He sent everything to Sophia and to a personal email account in the same motion. Then he walked toward the yard to find Carla Torres, because Carla Torres had pulled her crew off the unit yesterday on his word. And if someone had put them back on, she needed to know that there was a problem. And if someone had put them back on without her knowledge, that was a different and more urgent problem. He found her in the yard supervisor's station, and from her expression when she saw him, he understood immediately that she hadn't been the one to restart the operation. "I got a call at 6 this morning from Carl Brandt's office," she said. "Operational continuity authorization, override on the shutdown pending review." She looked at him steadily. She'd been doing this for 11 years. She knew what that look on his face meant. "I asked for documentation, and they emailed it while I was on the phone. It had Ms. Whitmore's name in the header." "It wasn't from Ms. Whitmore," Ryan said. Carla looked at the crane. "What do I do?" "Right now, pull the load down and get your crew out of the operational radius. Tell them it's a precautionary hold. Don't mention the override. Don't mention me. Just get them clear." "And the documentation I received?" "Save everything. Don't delete. Don't modify." He met her eyes. "Carla, I need you to trust me on this." She held his gaze for a moment with the expression of a person making a calculation based on what they knew about someone's track record. Then she picked up her radio. Ryan was already moving back toward the building when his phone buzzed. Sophia, pulling into the facility lot. He was halfway across the yard when he heard it, a sound he recognized before his brain had fully processed it, a sound that lived in a specific place in his memory from years ago. A metallic groan, low and structural. The kind of sound that didn't come from normal operation but from something under stress that had reached its limit. He turned and looked at the number 2 crane. The mast assembly at the lower bearing housing was moving in a way mast assemblies don't move. Everything that happened next happened fast. He was running before the thought was fully formed, radio in hand, already shouting Carla's call sign, already calculating the swing radius, the load path, the 3 crew members he could see in the staging area below who were not inside the operational radius because Carla had moved them, but who were still too close to the secondary debris field if the load came down at an angle. His voice was coming out of him in a register he'd never used in 4 years at Whitmore, a register he'd hoped he'd never use again, full and commanding and cutting across the yard noise without effort, because some things you learn in a crisis and never fully unlearn. "Everybody out, full radius, move now. Carla, all personnel, full radius, the load is coming." He reached the first crew member, a young guy named Marcus who was 23 and had started 6 months ago and was standing with his back to the crane looking at a manifest on a tablet, and physically moved him by the shoulder, pointing, and the young man ran without needing more than that because there was something in Ryan's voice that communicated past the need for explanation. The groan from the mast assembly deepened. Ryan moved. He knew where everyone was because he had walked this yard twice a day for 3 years, and he knew where they stood and how they moved and the particular habits of this particular crew. He got the second crew member, a woman named Diane, who was 60 feet out and moving already because she'd heard the sound, and redirected her toward the building. He got the third, a forklift operator named Tomas, who had climbed down from his machine and was standing uncertain near the loading dock, and he shouted at Tomas to get inside the building, and Tomas went. He had cleared the full yard radius by the time the mast housing let go. The number 2 crane didn't fall. That was the thing about structural failures. They weren't always cinematic. The mast buckled at the lower housing, dropping the load. The shipping container came down at an angle. Not free fall, a controlled terrible descent that hit the concrete staging area with a concussive impact that Ryan felt in his chest from 60 feet away and threw a wave of dust and debris across the yard. The crane's upper assembly swung and caught against the gantry rail, which bent badly but held, and the whole structure settled into a collapsed lean against the rail system at about a 40-degree angle. The staging area where the crew had been standing 2 minutes ago was buried under debris. Ryan stood in the silence that followed impact and breathed. Around him, people were running out of the building. Carla, already on her radio, her voice steady and professional, calling the incident in. Other workers who had heard the impact from inside. He did a visual sweep of the yard, counting faces, cross-referencing against the mental list he'd been running. Everyone was out. He counted again. Everyone was out. He became aware that his hands were shaking slightly, which he noticed without judgment. Hands shook sometimes, after. That was a body thing, not a mind thing. His mind was still running clear. He heard his name from behind him and turned. Sophia was crossing the yard at a near run, and she'd gotten here fast enough that she must have already been inside the gate. She looked at the collapsed crane, and then at Ryan, and then at the empty staging area, and something moved across her face that he didn't have a word for. Relief and horror occupying the same expression simultaneously. "Everyone's clear," he said before she asked. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him with an intensity that had nothing to do with CEO and employee, nothing to do with professional roles or organizational hierarchy or any of the frameworks that usually structured the distance between them. She was just a person, looking at another person who had just seen the thing he'd been warning about happen exactly the way he'd said it would. "Ryan," she said. "I'm fine," he said. And then, because his hands were still shaking slightly, and she could probably see that, "Give me a second." She gave him the second. She stood there with him in the yard while the dust settled, and Carla managed the incident call, and the rest of the facility moved into its emergency response protocol. She didn't touch him, or crowd him, or fill the space with words. She just stood there, which was exactly the right thing to do. After a minute, the shaking stopped. He looked at the collapsed crane, at the staging area, at the bent gantry rail, and the shipping container sitting at the wrong angle on broken concrete. "We need to call legal," he said, "and we need to get Pete Sorensen's documentation into their hands before Monday." She nodded. Her voice was steady when she spoke, the executive part of her back in control, but underneath it something had changed. Not in this moment, but irreversibly, in the way that witnessing a truth you'd been told finally confirms something you'd only believed before. "Already calling. And Ryan," she met his eyes. "Whatever Marcus tries to file, whatever story comes out of this weekend, I have the override documentation, I have the timestamps, and I have Gregor's report. All of it." "Good. We're going to need it." She looked at the crane. "Because he's going to say this was equipment failure. He's going to make it about maintenance schedules and operational variance and liability frameworks." "I know," Ryan said. "But I was here," she said quietly. "I saw where everyone was standing, and I know why they weren't standing there anymore." He looked at her. She looked back at him. In the yard around them, Saturday morning continued. Sirens approaching in the distance, the facility response team moving with purpose, Carla's steady voice on the radio, the particular controlled chaos of an emergency that had been caught just in time. Just in time. Ryan put his phone in his pocket and looked at the damage and thought about a 7-year-old girl asking him to be careful, and thought, "I was." The sirens arrived 7 minutes after Carla's call, which Ryan noted without particular satisfaction. 7 minutes was within the expected response window for a structural incident at an industrial facility, which meant the system was working the way systems were supposed to work, which was a thing he'd spent years not being able to say without qualification. 2 fire units and an emergency response coordinator from the city. Carla met them at the gate with the incident documentation already compiled, because Carla had been doing this long enough to know that the first thing emergency responders needed was paper, and the second thing was someone who could talk without panicking. She was good at both. Ryan stayed in the yard while the responders did their sweep, doing what he did on every incident. Staying out of the way of people whose job it was to handle the immediate situation while remaining available for the technical questions that would come. They came within 12 minutes. The response coordinator, a compact woman named Fitch, who wore her authority without advertising it, found Ryan near the collapsed crane and asked him to walk her through the structural failure sequence. He walked her through it. He used precise language because precise language was what she needed, and because he'd stopped softening technical information for non-technical audiences a long time ago. In his experience, people understood more than you gave them credit for when you trusted them with the actual words. Fitch took notes and asked good questions, and at the end said, "You evacuated the full radius before the failure?" "Yes." "How much lead time?" He thought about it. "Roughly 90 seconds from when I heard the first stress groan to primary failure. I had the staging area cleared in under a minute." Fitch looked at the staging area. The debris field, the broken concrete, the shipping container resting at its wrong angle. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. "How many people were in that radius when you started the evacuation?" "3, plus a forklift operator near the dock." She wrote something down. Then she looked at him with the expression of someone doing math that has a clear answer. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to need your full statement." He gave it. Standing in the yard with the November cold coming through his jacket, he told Fitch everything in sequence. The external review request, Gregor's report, the shutdown order, the override, Pete Sorensen's call, the morning sequence of events. He was factual and complete and did not editorialize. Fitch recorded it on her tablet and asked 3 clarifying questions, and then told him she'd be in touch and moved on to speak with Carla. Ryan stood in the yard afterward for a moment. The adrenaline had metabolized by now. That chemical clarity that arrived during the emergency and stayed for the first 20 minutes was fading, leaving behind the particular tiredness that came after your body had made a lot of demands in a short period. He was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, as information, not as something to be managed right now. He went inside to find Sophia. She was in the 4th floor conference room, not the small one, the main one, with the company's general counsel, a senior woman named Patricia Holt, who Ryan had seen in meetings twice and who had the specific demeanor of someone who had handled crises before and found them, if not exactly routine, then at least navigable with sufficient preparation. Patricia had arrived within 40 minutes of Sophia's call, which suggested she either lived nearby or had been called early enough that she'd had time to get there, and Ryan suspected the latter. The table had documents on it, printed copies of everything Ryan had sent, organized in a way that suggested Patricia had been reviewing them for at least 20 minutes already. Gregor's report was separated from the operational logs, which were separated from the maintenance records, which were separated from the override documentation with Marcus Vale's authorization flagged in yellow. Sophia looked up when Ryan came in. She had changed her expression since the yard, not composed exactly, but reorganized. The CEO part of her had reasserted itself over the person who'd stood beside him in the dust and said nothing for a minute while his hand steadied. He understood this and found it neither cold nor surprising. There was a time for one mode and a time for the other, and she knew the difference. "Patricia, this is Ryan Carter, our safety supervisor," Sophia said. "He's the one who initiated the external review and who executed the evacuation." Patricia looked at him with the assessing gaze of a person who forms professional opinions quickly. "I've been reading your documentation," she said. "It's thorough." "Thank you." "Sit down." It wasn't quite a command. Almost. "I need to ask you some things." He sat. The questions Patricia asked were precise and legal in their framing, not what had happened, she had that, but about the chain of communication, who had said what to whom and when, what was documented versus verbal, what he had observed directly versus what he'd been told. He answered all of them with the same precision she brought to asking them. At one point she said, "Marcus Vale's operational override. You said the documentation sent to Yard Supervisor Torres used Ms. Whitmore's name in the header. Do you know how?" "No," Ryan said. "That's above my pay grade. I can tell you it wasn't authorized by Ms. Whitmore because she told me directly that the shutdown order was final. But how the document was constructed is something your team would need to look at." Patricia made a note. "And Pete Sorensen's records. The documentation he forwarded to his personal email. Has he been contacted since your conversation this morning?" "Not by me. I told him to communicate only with you or Ms. Whitmore directly." "Good." Patricia looked at Sophia. "I need to speak with Sorensen today, and I need IT to preserve the full email server records from the past 3 years, specifically anything touching the Harrington contract maintenance approvals before anyone with administrative access has the opportunity to manage that data." Already issued, Sophia said. I called IT before you got here. Patricia nodded once, which from her was apparently approval. The board meeting, she said. 3 weeks out. Yes. This will be an agenda item. Patricia looked at the documents. The question is whether it's an agenda item where the board is responding to a safety incident or where they're responding to a safety incident that was caused by documented misconduct within the operations leadership team. She paused. The second is a significantly different meeting. It's the second, Sophia said flatly. I know that, Patricia said. I want to make sure we can prove it. Ryan looked at the documents spread across the table. The evidence chain is clear, he said. The flagged items from 8 months ago, the expedited approval, the override on a formal shutdown order, the timestamps on all of it. It builds in a sequence that's hard to characterize as coincidence. Marcus Vale's team will characterize it as aggressive interpretation of normal operational decision-making, Patricia said. Expedited approvals happen. Override authority exists for business reasons. A single engineer's concern about load readings is not, in standard corporate framing, sufficient to halt a contract-critical operation. A single engineer's concern that was validated by an external certified inspector, Ryan said. Yes. Patricia looked at him. That's the difference. Gregor Haas's report is the fulcrum. Without it, this is a supervisory disagreement about risk tolerance. With it, it's documented evidence that Vale's team approved continued operation of equipment that a certified engineering assessment had identified as carrying meaningful risk of catastrophic failure. She straightened the stack of documents. And then the failure occurred, exactly as documented. The room was quiet for a moment. What does Vale do next? Ryan asked. Patricia and Sophia exchanged a look, the kind of look that passes between people who have already had part of this conversation. He distances himself from the override, Sophia said. He's going to argue that the override was within his operational authority, that he was acting on the information available to him, that Gregor's report hadn't been formally presented through proper channels. It had, Ryan said. I sent it to your office and CC'd operations leadership simultaneously. I know. Her voice was steady. He's going to argue it anyway, and then he's going to pivot to questioning the evacuation response, whether proper protocols were followed, whether the decision to clear the yard was justified given the information available at that moment. And if that doesn't work? She stopped. He goes after me personally, Ryan said. She looked at him. Yes. Ryan sat with that. He'd known it was coming. It was the move you made when the factual ground was lost, when the evidence didn't support your position, when the last available tool was discrediting the person who'd found you out. He had been discredited before. He knew what it felt like, and he knew that knowing what it felt like didn't make it significantly less unpleasant. Let him, Ryan said. Both women looked at him. Let him try, he said. My documentation is complete. My record at this facility is 3 years of 0 lost time incidents, 2 commendations from the floor teams, and a maintenance report system that Carla Torres will testify I built from scratch because the previous one was inadequate. The external review was my initiative, approved through proper channels, documented in writing. The shutdown order was complied with through proper channels, documented in writing. The override was not. He looked at Sophia. He doesn't have anything to work with. He'll look for something, Patricia said. He can look. Ryan picked up his coffee, which had gone cold sometime in the past hour. I'm not hard to research. There's a professional record that precedes Whitmore. He'll find the incident at the grain processing facility. He'll find the settlement. He'll try to frame it as a pattern of difficult behavior or poor judgment. And, Sophia asked, and that incident is why I know what I know about what happens when safety documentation gets managed by people with conflicting interests. He set the coffee down. If he uses it, it works in our favor. Patricia looked at him for a moment with an expression that had shifted slightly from assessing to something more like considered respect. You've thought about this. I've had time to think about it, he said. I've known since Thursday that this was coming. The rest of Saturday was long and administrative in the way that aftermath always was. Statements, documentation, a call with the company's insurance carrier that Sophia handled from the conference room while Ryan and Patricia worked through the evidentiary timeline. The emergency responders cleared the yard by early afternoon, leaving behind an incident marker and a site restriction order that would stay in place until the structural damage was formally assessed. Ryan got home at 4:30. Mrs. Albrecht had fed Lily lunch, and they'd apparently spent 2 hours doing a puzzle because it was spread across the living room floor when Ryan walked in. A 500-piece ocean floor scene, about 60% complete, with Lily sitting cross-legged in the middle of it looking for a piece that was probably under the coffee table. "You made it for dinner," she said, without looking up. "I did." She found the piece under the coffee table exactly where he'd have guessed. "Are things safe now?" He sat down on the floor next to her, still in his jacket, looked at the half-assembled ocean floor puzzle, found a piece near his knee that looked like it belonged somewhere on the left side. "Getting there," he said honestly. She nodded, accepting this, and pointed at the piece in his hand. "That goes over there, by the whale shark." He put it where she pointed. It fit. They sat on the floor and worked on the puzzle for 40 minutes, and he said very little and she said quite a lot. About the whale shark, about the puzzle's difficulty level, about something that had happened at school on Friday, involving a misunderstanding about whose turn it was on the swings that had apparently resolved itself. He listened and responded and occasionally found a piece and placed it, and the afternoon moved forward in that ordinary, grounding way that ordinary things move when the extraordinary part of a day is finished. He made pasta for dinner. Nothing elaborate. Jarred sauce because he was tired and honest about it. Penne because Lily liked the shape. Garlic bread from a package in the freezer. She ate 2 full bowls and talked about a book she'd gotten from the library about the Mariana Trench. And Ryan ate his pasta and looked at his daughter across the kitchen table and felt, in a way that was hard to articulate, the particular solidity of a life that had held. He put her to bed at 8:30. She asked him to read 1 chapter of the Mariana Trench book, which he did, and by the end of the chapter she was fighting sleep with the transparent determination of a child who doesn't want to miss anything, her eyes closing and then opening again with effort. "Daddy," she said, voice already fuzzy with sleep. "Yeah." "Was anyone hurt today?" He looked at her. He told her almost nothing specific about the day, but she was 7 and perceptive in the way of children who had grown up paying careful attention to the adults around them. "No," he said. "Everyone's okay." She processed this with her eyes closed. "Because of you?" He thought about Carla Torres on the radio, about Pete Sorensen's phone call, about Gregor Haas's 11 pages of methodical precision, about Sophia, who had moved to lock the operational files on a Friday night. "Because of a lot of people doing their jobs," he said. She was asleep before he finished the sentence. Monday came with a different weight than the previous one. Ryan drove to the facility on the 7A, and the traffic was the same and the sky was the same gray, and he drank the same bad coffee from the break room machine. But the facility itself felt different in the way places feel different after something has happened in them. Not haunted exactly, but altered. The yard had a restricted zone around the number 2 crane. The Harrington contract had been officially suspended pending investigation, which Ryan had gotten notification of via a Sunday evening email from Patricia Holt's office. The floor crews walked with the slightly subdued energy of people who had processed something and were still processing it. Carla Torres stopped him at the door to the supervisor's station. She was carrying a coffee and a folder, and she looked like someone who had also had a long weekend. "The young guy," she said. "Marcus." Ryan remembered. The 23-year-old he'd physically redirected in the yard. "He came in this morning and asked me to pass along that he's glad you were there." Ryan looked at his coffee. "Tell him to come find me if he wants to." "I'll do that." Carla paused. "How's your weekend?" "Puzzle and pasta," he said. She looked at him with the expression of someone who knew there was significantly more to the weekend than puzzle and pasta and was choosing to let it go. "Good," she said, and went back to work. The emergency board meeting had been called for Tuesday. It was not a scheduled meeting. Patricia Holt had convened it over the weekend with direct contact to the board chair, a procedural option that existed for exactly these situations. Ryan knew about it because Sophia had told him Sunday evening in a text that was unusually brief even by their standards. "Board meeting Tuesday. You'll be asked to present. Bring everything." He spent Monday building the presentation. Not a polished deck. Sophia hadn't asked for that, and his instinct was that this was not a situation that called for polish. It called for sequence. The sequence was clear. The external review request and its approval, Gregor's report, The shutdown order, the override documentation, Pete Sorensen's records, the timestamps on all of it, and then the failure itself. Photographs from his phone, Carla's incident report, Fitch's preliminary findings from the emergency response. He arranged it in chronological order because chronological order was the most honest order, the one that showed not just what happened, but how it happened, decision by decision, choice by choice. He was still at his desk at 7 in the evening when he heard Marcus Vale's voice in the hallway. Not raised. That wasn't Marcus's style. The hallway sound was conversational, relaxed, the voice of a man walking through a space he still considered his. Ryan heard him say something to someone, heard a response he couldn't make out, heard the particular rhythm of an exchange that was friendly on the surface and navigational underneath. He sat at his desk and waited. Marcus knocked this time, which was different from Thursday. He came in and stood just inside the door, and he was wearing the relaxed expression of a man who has spent the weekend consulting with lawyers and has arrived at a position he's comfortable with. "You're here late," Marcus said. "Board presentation tomorrow," Ryan said. Marcus nodded, as if this was incidental information. "I wanted to have a conversation before that," he said. "Off the record, person to person." Ryan put down his pen. "All right. What happened Saturday was unfortunate," Marcus said. He said it with the particular precision of a lawyer-coached phrase. Unfortunate, not wrong, not negligent, not dangerous. Equipment failure happens in industrial environments. It's a statistical reality. "It wasn't equipment failure," Ryan said. "The equipment did exactly what documented stress patterns predicted it would do. That's the opposite of failure." Marcus's expression didn't flicker. "There are going to be competing interpretations of the maintenance records," he said. "Reasonable people can review the same data and reach different conclusions about risk tolerance and operational necessity." "Gregor Hassa isn't a reasonable person who reached a conclusion," Ryan said. "He's a certified engineer who filed a professional assessment. It's not competing interpretations. It's his report versus your decision to override the shutdown. My decision was within my operational authority. Then you can explain that to the board tomorrow." The air between them changed slightly. Marcus was a man who had spent 20 years winning these conversations, and he was feeling the particular discomfort of a conversation that wasn't going the way they were supposed to go. Ryan watched him make a small adjustment, the kind of recalibration that happened when the direct approach wasn't working. "You've been at this company 3 years," Marcus said. His tone stayed even, which was its own kind of pressure. "You do good work. The floor teams respect you, that's real. I'm not dismissing it." A small pause. "I've also looked at your professional history. Before Whitmore." There it was. Ryan held Marcus's gaze without changing his expression. "The incident at the grain processing facility," Marcus continued. "The structural report, the settlement." He said it carefully, not with the weight of an accusation, but with the weight of information that might, in the right context, become one. "I'm not saying it reflects on your work here. I'm saying that a board meeting is a specific context, and certain background details tend to color how people receive information." Ryan thought about what he'd told Sophia in Patricia's conference room. Let him try. "Are you threatening to bring that up?" Ryan asked. "I'm being transparent about what the conversation might look like," Marcus said. "I think you're a professional, and I'd rather handle this professionally. There's room here for a version of this that doesn't require making things adversarial." "What version is that?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "The crane failed due to maintenance deficiencies that were within the operational variance documented in the approved inspection records. The timeline was aggressive but defensible. You identified a concern and raised it appropriately. The external review process was initiated. The failure occurred before the review could be completed and acted upon. That's a narrative about an imperfect system, not about any individual's misconduct." A pause. "Everyone comes out of Tuesday with their position intact." Ryan looked at him for a long moment. He thought about a plant manager who'd buried a structural report. He thought about the revised document with his name on language he hadn't written. He thought about the settlement that barely covered the legal fees and the career that ended, and the 4-year-old he'd come home to who had been waiting for an explanation that he couldn't give her in terms she could understand, so he told her mommy wasn't coming back and held her while she cried. He thought about 3 crew members standing in a staging area that was now buried under debris. No, Ryan said. Marcus blinked. Slightly. Barely. But Ryan saw it. The version you're describing requires Pete Sorensen to go on record misrepresenting what he was asked to sign. It requires Carla Torres to characterize a fraudulent override document as a legitimate operational communication. It requires Gregor Hassa to revise the conclusion of a professional engineering assessment. Ryan kept his voice level, the same register he used for everything, the register he'd spent years developing because flat and clear was harder to dismiss than emotional. None of those people are going to do that, and even if they would, I wouldn't ask them to. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Marcus said. I know, Ryan said. I'm fine with that. Marcus stood there for a moment. The relaxed posture was still in place, but it was doing more work now, holding something together that wanted to come apart. The board is going to have questions about your history, he said. It wasn't a threat anymore exactly. It had moved into something closer to a statement of fact delivered as a last option. Then I'll answer them, Ryan said. All of them. Every detail of what happened at that facility and afterward. I'll explain exactly what a falsified safety report looks like, how the pressure to produce one works, what happens when the people with authority decide that a timeline is more important than a warning. He paused. I think the board will find it very relevant context. Marcus looked at him. Something had shifted in his face, not dramatically, just at the margins, the way a structure shifts when the thing holding it in place has given way. Good luck tomorrow, Ryan said. He picked up his pen and looked back at his presentation. After a moment, Marcus left. He closed the door behind him this time. Ryan sat for a moment. He wasn't sure if what he felt was satisfaction or exhaustion or some combination that didn't have a clean name. He looked at the presentation on his desk. He picked up his pen. He had work to finish. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. The first genuinely cold day of the season. The kind of sharp November air that came in overnight and left the world looking the same, but feeling different. Ryan dropped Lily at school. She had a science presentation that she'd been practicing all weekend, something about deep-sea bioluminescence that she'd distilled into a poster with drawings that were better than a 7-year-old's drawings had any right to be, and drove to the facility with his folder on the passenger seat and the particular internal stillness that came when something large and unavoidable was finally just in front of you. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 10. Ryan arrived at 9, walked the floor as always, spoke to Carla, checked the incident restriction zone, drank bad coffee. At 9:40, he went to the executive conference room on 5, the big one, the formal one that Ryan had been in exactly twice in 3 years, and set up his materials. The board members arrived between 9:50 and 10:05. There were 7 of them, ranging from a 70-year-old retired logistics executive who had been with Whitmore since Sophia's father's era to a 42-year-old former operations consultant who had joined 2 years ago and asked questions that consistently surprised Ryan with their precision. Sophia sat at the head of the table. Patricia Holt was present. Ryan sat 3 seats down from Sophia, across from where Marcus Vail was already seated when Ryan came in, arranged and composed. Carl Brandt sat at the far end of the table. He'd said almost nothing since Saturday, which Ryan had noted and filed. Sophia opened the meeting. On Saturday morning, the number 2-yard crane at this facility underwent structural failure, resulting in a full mass collapse and loss of load in the primary staging area. No personnel were injured. She said it plainly, without softening and without drama. The sequence of events that preceded that failure is the subject of this meeting. Ryan Carter, our facility safety supervisor, will present the documentation. Ryan stood up. He looked at the board members and he thought about every version of this moment he'd rehearsed in his head over the years. The testimony he'd never fully gotten to give. The documentation that had been overtaken by lawyers and settlements, and the particular machinery of institutional self-protection. He thought about the meeting that hadn't happened at a different facility, 14 months before a different failure, where someone like him had tried to say what he was about to say and had been managed into silence. He put the first document on the table. He started talking. He went through it in sequence, every item, in order, in plain language. He didn't frame, he didn't persuade, he didn't argue. He described what the data showed and what the documentation said and what had happened as a result. When he reached the override, he presented the document with Marcus's authorization and the timestamp showing it had been issued less than 12 hours after Sophia's shutdown order, and he let that sit on the table without commentary. When he reached Pete Sorensen's records, he described the call, time, content, what Pete had described about the pressure he'd received to expedite the approvals. He noted that Pete was available to testify directly if the board required it. When he reached Saturday morning, he presented Fitch's preliminary findings from the emergency response, clear language about the failure sequence, about the consistency between the failure mode and Gregor's documented prediction, about the occupancy status of the staging area at the time of failure. He sat down. The board chair, the 70-year-old retired executive, a man named Harold Cross, who had the expression of someone who had seen a great deal and was genuinely surprised very rarely, looked at the documents in front of him for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. "Mr. Vale," Harold said, "the override documentation. Walk me through the authorization." Marcus had his position prepared. He delivered it well. The override authority existed within his operational scope. The shutdown order had not been presented through the formal chain of review. The external inspector's report had not been formally routed through operations leadership. And the business reality of the Harrington contract penalties had made a 15-day shutdown a decision requiring executive-level consideration rather than unilateral safety department action. Harold listened. The other board members listened. Ryan watched their faces. "The external inspector's report," said the 42-year-old, whose name was Grace Weller. "You said it hadn't been formally routed through operations leadership. It was sent directly to this office by the inspector and CC'd simultaneously to Ms. Whitmore and to operations leadership. That's in the documentation." She looked at Marcus. "You received that email?" A brief pause. "I received it, yes," Marcus said. "I didn't characterize it as a final engineering determination. It was titled Final Engineering Assessment," Grace said. "Page 1, first line." Another pause. This one slightly longer. Harold looked at Sophia. "The documentation regarding the override. Ms. Whitmore, can you confirm the timeline of your shutdown order versus the override authorization?" "The shutdown order was issued Friday at 2:17 p.m., Sophia said. "The override was time-stamped Friday at 9:44 p.m. Harold was quiet for a moment. He looked at his documents. "And the document sent to Yard Supervisor Torres, which bore your name in the header." "I did not send that document," Sophia said. "I did not authorize it. It has preserved the full email record and is conducting a forensic review of its origin." The room was quiet in a specific way. Not the silence of people who have no reaction, but the silence of people who are having a reaction they're managing carefully. Harold Cross looked at Marcus Vale with the expression of a man who had been doing this for 50 years and had no particular patience left for the version of this conversation where everyone pretended they weren't all looking at the same thing. "Marcus," Harold said, did you authorize someone acting on your behalf to generate documentation purporting to be from Ms. Whitmore's office to override a safety shutdown on equipment that a certified engineer had formally assessed as carrying meaningful risk of catastrophic failure?" The question landed in the room with all its weight and stayed there. Marcus looked at Harold. He looked at the documents. He looked at Sophia, who met his gaze with an expression that was entirely still. He looked at Ryan. Ryan held it. No expression, no editorial, just present. "I'd like to consult with legal counsel before responding to that specific question," Marcus said. Harold nodded slowly. "I think that's probably wise," he said. His tone made it clear that the answer to the question had just been answered. Grace Weller looked at Sophia. "I'd like to hear from Ms. Whitmore about the path forward." Sophia had been waiting for this. She spoke for 8 minutes, which Ryan timed because he found himself tracking it. Clear, organized, the specific combination of executive authority and personal accountability that she brought when she was at her best. She described the investigation that Patricia's team had already initiated, the steps taken to preserve evidence, the third-party audit she was commissioning for the full equipment maintenance record across all facility assets, the operational review she was initiating of the inspection approval process. She described the suspension of the Harrington contract pending investigation and the communication that had already gone to the Harrington team, explaining the situation in terms that were honest without being legally prejudicial. When she finished, Harold Cross looked around the table. Board members confirmed support with the brief, deliberate nods of people who understood what they were agreeing to. Harold looked at Marcus. "You're suspended from operational authority pending the outcome of the investigation," he said. "Effective immediately. Patricia will handle the formal process." Marcus said nothing. He gathered his folder with steady hands. Ryan gave him that, the steadiness, and stood up and walked to the door. He paused there for a moment with his hand on the frame, and Ryan expected him to say something. One final thing, some version of the conversation they'd had in his office the night before, delivered now for the board's benefit. He didn't. He opened the door and walked out. The room exhaled. Harold Cross looked down the table at Ryan. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you flagged this issue how far in advance of the failure?" "I requested the external review 8 days before the failure," Ryan said. "I identified the specific discrepancy in the maintenance records 6 days out. The shutdown order was issued 4 days out." Harold was quiet for a moment. "And your professional background? You flagged yourself as a structural engineer in your testimony." "Yes, before coming to Whitmore." "Why are you a safety supervisor and not an engineer?" It was a direct question, and Harold Cross was clearly a man who asked direct questions because he wanted direct answers. Ryan thought about how to answer it. He thought about all the ways he could answer it. The professional version, the abbreviated version, the version that left out the things that still had edges. He thought about what he'd said to Sophia at Oleander in the first unguarded conversation he'd had in years, and about how the unguarded version was always the truer one. "Because I made a choice after a significant professional and personal loss," Ryan said. "I wanted a role with direct, unmediated control over safety outcomes. I was done with layers." He paused. "It was the right decision for where I was at the time." Harold looked at him for a moment. "And now?" Ryan met his eyes. "Now I'm less sure the layers are the problem," he said. "I think the problem is usually the people in the layers." Harold Cross looked at him for a moment longer. Then something moved in the old man's face. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. "Yes," he said quietly. "It usually is." And the meeting ended at noon. People dispersed with the subdued efficiency of aftermath, Patricia with her phone already to her ear, board members in quiet pairs, Sophia speaking briefly to Harold Cross at the door in the tone of two people who have known each other long enough to skip the formal register. Ryan gathered his materials. He was at the elevator when he heard Sophia come up behind him. "Harold wants a debrief next week," she said. "And Grace Weller asked me specifically whether your role here reflects your actual level of expertise." She paused. I told her it didn't. The elevator arrived. They both stepped in. "I was going to talk to you about that," she said. "The role. What comes next? In terms of what we actually need you doing here." She looked at the elevator doors. "There are going to be decisions to make about the inspection and maintenance infrastructure across all facilities. Not just this one. We have 7 properties in the region. Someone needs to own that work at a level that actually matches the scope." "That's a different job than what I have," Ryan said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." The elevator stopped at 4. Neither of them moved for a second. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now," she said. "I'm telling you that the conversation is coming." She looked at him. "And that I want you in it." He looked at the elevator doors. He thought about the wall, brick by careful brick. He thought about how much of the last 3 years had been defined by what he was keeping out and how much by what he was actually building inside it. "Okay," he said. She nodded. The doors opened. She stepped out and turned back. "Go home," she said. "Your daughter had a science presentation today." "Bioluminescence," he said. "Deep sea." Something shifted in her expression, warm and brief. "Go find out how it went." He did. Lily's bioluminescence poster had gotten a standing ovation from her 2nd grade class, which was her word for it. Standing ovation, delivered with the complete seriousness of a 7-year-old reporting a fact. Ryan heard about it in the car on the way home from school, in the particular breathless run-on way she told stories when something had gone well, and he listened and asked questions and felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight since Saturday morning. "Mrs. Garza said my anglerfish drawing was the best part," Lily said. But I think the barrel eye was actually better because the eyes are harder to draw. They are harder, Ryan agreed. Did you know barrel eye eyes can rotate? Like all the way up, so they can look through their own head. I did not know that. It's true. I put it on the poster, but I ran out of room, so I had to write it really small at the bottom. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. How was your meeting? It went okay, he said. She processed this in the way she processed things, briefly, then moving on, trusting his assessment without requiring details she'd sense he didn't want to give. That was something she'd developed in the years of it being just the two of them, a fine-grained ability to read when he meant what he said and when he was protecting her from something. He thought she'd probably deserve the full story someday, when she was old enough to understand what it meant, when the word accountability had weight to it that wasn't just vocabulary. Not tonight. Tonight was pasta again, because he was tired again, and because some things become rituals by accident, and pasta on hard days had become one of theirs. The investigation took 6 weeks. In the way of these things, it was not a single event, but a process. Methodical, documented, expanding in scope as the forensic IT review and Patricia Holt's team worked through the Whitmore operational records and found that what Ryan had uncovered in the number 2 crane was not an isolated case but a pattern that had been running for at least 4 years. 3 other facilities in the regional network showed evidence of the same approach. Maintenance approvals expedited ahead of contract delivery windows, flagged follow-up items quietly closed without documentation of resolution. Inspection timelines compressed in ways that fell below regulatory minimums but had been obscured by the way the records were organized. Carl Brandt resigned in the second week. His resignation letter, which Ryan heard about from Patricia rather than reading directly, apparently described his actions as good-faith operational decisions made under significant business pressure, which was probably true and also entirely beside the point. Pete Sorensen gave a formal deposition that lasted 4 hours, during which he described 3 years of low-grade institutional pressure with the careful detail of a man who had been keeping records precisely because some part of him knew the pressure wasn't right. His records held up completely. Marcus Vail did not resign. He retained independent counsel and contested the investigation's framing, which Patricia had anticipated and prepared for. The forensic IT review found what it found. The email that had misused Sophia's name in the header to issue the override had been generated from a workstation registered to Carl Brandt's administrative assistant, with access credentials that traced back through 2 layers of delegation to Marcus's office. Not a clean line, but a line. The kind of line that, in a legal context, was sufficient to establish a pattern of behavior even when direct personal authorization couldn't be proven for every step. Marcus's lawyer sent a letter in week 4 suggesting a settlement and confidentiality agreement. Sophia declined it, which was her call, and which Ryan heard about via a text that read simply, "Declined." Board concurred. He had texted back, "Good." She had responded with the same period she used when something was understood. By week 6, the formal findings were complete. Marcus Vail was terminated for cause. The company filed civil claims that Ryan did not follow in detail because his job was not to follow the civil claims. The regulatory body that oversaw industrial safety compliance opened its own inquiry into the maintenance practices across all 7 Whitmore facilities, which was an outcome Sophia had anticipated and had proactively cooperated with, getting ahead of the narrative in the way of someone who understood that transparency in a crisis was the only version that held. Ryan gave his own testimony to the regulatory inquiry on a Wednesday afternoon. He was in the room for 3 hours. He answered every question completely, including the ones about the grain processing facility, including the falsified report, including the settlement and what it had cost him professionally and personally. He had offered this information proactively before it could be used as a counterweight, and the regulatory investigators had received it the way he'd expected, as relevant professional context from someone who had, in their words, demonstrated a consistent record of prioritizing structural safety over institutional convenience. That was their language, not his, but he didn't object to it. He drove home from the regulatory office in the early November dark and stopped at the grocery store because they were out of strawberry preserves. Sophia offered him the regional safety director position at the end of the 6th week in the 4th floor small conference room. The same one, Ryan noticed, where they'd first laid out the evidence together, where she'd told him she was calling legal, where the thing had begun its formal unraveling. He thought she might have chosen it deliberately. He couldn't tell. The offer was detailed and serious. Regional Safety Director for all 7 Whitmore facilities, with full engineering authority over inspection protocols, maintenance approval processes, and compliance standards. A team reporting to him, 2 junior safety officers, an engineering consultant on retainer, direct access to external inspection firms without going through operations leadership for approval. A budget he controlled. A title that matched the scope. A salary that was, frankly, a significant step from where he'd been, which he noted without embarrassment because he had a daughter who was going to want to attend college in 11 years, and who had an interest in oceanography that he intended to support. He read the offer document. He thought about it for 24 hours, which was as long as he allowed himself, because he'd been waiting for something like this without admitting he'd been waiting, and he didn't want to spend a long time pretending to deliberate when his answer was already clear. He went back to the conference room the following afternoon. "Yes," he said, "with one condition." Sophia looked at him across the table. "Tell me." "Every safety decision in this company goes through a formal documentation chain with accountability at every step," he said. "Not because I don't trust the people I'm working with, because the record has to exist independent of who the people are. Because people change, business pressures change, and the record is the only thing that doesn't change with them." He paused. "No informal overrides. No expedited approvals without documented engineering sign-off. No situation where someone in operations can apply pressure to an inspector without that pressure being formally recorded and escalated." Sophia nodded. She'd been nodding slightly since he started. Not the polite nodding of someone waiting for him to finish, but the nodding of someone hearing something confirmed. "I was going to propose the same structure," she said. "I want it in the operations charter, not just the safety manual. Structural, not procedural." "Good. I'd also like you to design the system," she said. "You're the person in this company with the most direct experience of what it looks like when the system fails. I'd rather have you build the version that doesn't." He looked at her across the table. He thought about building things. He'd spent 4 years building a wall, careful and deliberate, brick by brick. He thought about what it might feel like to build something that opened outward instead. "I can do that," he said. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it, which was a formal gesture between 2 people who had moved well past formality, and they both knew it, and neither of them mentioned it. "Wednesday, you start?" she asked. "Monday," he said. "I have a floor to walk first." He told Lily that night, at the kitchen table, after the strawberry preserves had been located and applied to toast that neither of them particularly needed at 8 in the evening, but that had become part of the conversation setting anyway. He told her about the new job. Not the full scope of what had led to it, not yet, but the shape of it. That he was going to be doing more of the kind of work he'd trained for a long time ago. That it meant more responsibility. That it meant he'd be protecting more people across more places. Lily ate her toast and considered this. "Is it what you used to do?" she asked. "Before?" He thought about how to answer. "Related to it," he said. "I'm going to be building a system to make sure people are safe, which is different from just being the person who spots the problem." "That sounds harder," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She looked at her toast. "Are you good at it?" The question was so direct and so sincere. Not a challenge, just genuine inquiry, the kind that children ask when they actually want to know, that it stopped him for a second. He thought about Gregor Hasse saying the wear pattern doesn't match the maintenance record. He thought about Pete Sorensen's phone call at 7:15 on a Saturday morning. He thought about 90 seconds between a structural groan and a mast failure, and 3 crew members who had been where they shouldn't have been and then weren't. "I think so," he said. She accepted this with a small nod. "Good," she said, the way she said things that were settled. Then, "Can you read 2 chapters tonight? I got a new book about the hydrothermal vents." He read 2 chapters. She fell asleep halfway through the second one, which was her pattern, and he closed the book and sat for a moment in the dim light of her room, with the particular feeling of a life that was, despite everything and against some of the odds, intact. The investigation findings were made public in December. A regulatory summary, a company statement, a press item that ran in the business section of 2 regional papers and 1 national trade publication. Ryan read the trade publication piece sitting at his desk in the new office space that had been allocated to the regional safety director role. A corner room on the 3rd floor with a window that looked out over the yard. The piece was accurate as these things went. It described the maintenance failures, the override, the evacuation, and the crane collapse, the investigation's findings. It mentioned Ryan by name once, as the safety supervisor whose external review had identified the structural risk. It mentioned Sophia by name in her capacity as CEO, who had initiated the investigation. It mentioned Marcus Vale's termination without extensive detail, which was legally appropriate and probably contributed to Ryan's blood pressure. He set the article down and looked out the window at the yard. The number 2 crane had been removed. The gantry rail had been repaired and recertified. In its place, a new unit was being installed, sourced through a different vendor, with a maintenance contract that Ryan had personally reviewed and approved, with a certification timeline that was not going to be expedited by anyone for any reason. The Harrington contract had been renegotiated. The delay penalties had been waived, partly because of the legal exposure the incident had created for the counterparty, mostly because Sophia had handled the conversation with the Harrington team in a way that was honest without being defensive, which had apparently earned enough professional respect that they'd extended the timeline rather than walking away. Ryan didn't know the details of that conversation. He knew only that Sophia came back from it with the expression of someone who'd done something difficult and come out the other side. He'd asked her about it once, briefly. "I told them what happened and why," she said. "I told them what we're building now. I told them that if they wanted a logistics partner who prioritized their delivery timeline over their workers' safety, we probably weren't the right company anymore." She paused. "They said they'd rather have a partner they could trust." Ryan had thought about that for a while afterward, about what it meant for a company to say this is who we are and have it be true, about how rarely that happened and what it cost when it did and what it cost more when it didn't. December became January, which brought the particular reset that New Year's brought, not transformation, because Ryan had long since stopped believing in transformation as a concept, but a reorientation. A chance to look at the map and confirm you were still going where you meant to go. He had been meeting Sophia for dinner approximately every 2 weeks since October. Not at Oleander. They'd been to Oleander once more, in November, and it had been good in the way second visits to significant places sometimes are, carrying the weight of the first one without being crushed by it. They'd been other places. A Thai restaurant near her apartment that she said had the best curry she'd found in the city, which was accurate. A place near Ryan's neighborhood that did a weekend brunch, which he'd suggested mostly because Lily had been asking about a particular kind of pancake she'd seen advertised in the window, and he thought it might be worth investigating. Sophia had come to that one with what Ryan identified as mild anxiety about what meeting Lily in an unstructured context would look like. And Lily had greeted her with the frank directness she applied to everything and asked her within 4 minutes what her favorite deep-sea creature was. Sophia had considered the question seriously. He'd noticed this, that she took Lily's questions with the same weight she took board questions, which was not a performance, and said she thought probably the giant isopod, because it looked like something that had decided it was going to be exactly what it wanted to be, regardless of anyone's expectations. Lily had said that was a good answer, which from her was real praise. They hadn't talked explicitly about what they were doing, because they were both people who found explicit conversations about undefined things slightly uncomfortable and also slightly beside the point. They were doing what they were doing. It was going somewhere they hadn't mapped out, which was new for both of them, and which neither of them was accelerating past the pace it wanted to go on its own. Ryan had learned, at 32, that he was not actually good at letting things unfold without managing them. This had been a useful piece of self-knowledge, held alongside the understanding that useful self-knowledge and changed behavior were not the same thing. He was working on it. Sophia, for her part, had mentioned once they were walking back from the Thai restaurant, early December, cold enough that their breath showed, that she'd started leaving her phone in her bag during dinners. Not because she'd made a rule about it, but because she'd noticed at some point that she didn't want to look at it, which was different from making herself not look at it. She said it like it was a small thing, It wasn't a small thing. He recognized that. That's new, he said. Yes, she said. She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. They'd walked another half block in comfortable quiet before she said, I spent a long time making myself very difficult to reach. Professionally, I mean. But the habit got out of scope. He thought about walls and about the things people built them for, and the ways the buildings sometimes outlasted their original purpose. Yeah, he said. I know how that goes. She glanced at him. I think you probably know better than most. Maybe, he said. I'm less sure the wall was the problem, looking back. I think it was right for a while. I just kept it past when it was useful. How do you know when it's past useful? He thought about it. Cold air, their breath clouding ahead of them, the city moving in its quiet December register. When the thing you built it to protect is in better shape than the wall, he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, that's a good answer. I've had time to think about it. She made the small sound that was related to a laugh without quite being one, and they turned the corner and the conversation moved on to something else, and the evening finished the way their evenings were finishing these days, naturally, without forced conclusions, with a certain quality of ease that Ryan had stopped expecting to feel with anyone, and had found anyway. The system Ryan had been asked to build took 3 months to design and 6 more to implement fully across all 7 facilities. He did not do it alone. That was a lesson he'd carried from his engineering years, that the systems with the longest lives were the ones built with input from the people who'd have to live inside them. He talked to floor crews at all 7 properties. He talked to Carla Torres extensively because Carla had spent 11 years doing the ground-level version of the work and knew where the actual friction points were, rather than the theoretical ones. He talked to Pete Sorensen, who had been formally cleared of misconduct and had remained with the company, and who turned out to have a detailed working knowledge of exactly how inspection pressure was applied in practice, which was invaluable. He designed an inspection protocol that had 3 independent sign-off points, each with a documented timestamp and a named individual responsible. Any flagged item required a certified engineering review before closure, with no exceptions for timeline or contract status. Any deviation from the maintenance schedule required formal written justification routed to Ryan's office and to Sophia's simultaneously. The approval chain for equipment operation included a safety clearance that could not be overridden by operations leadership without a board-level authorization, an authorization that would, by definition, create a formal record. He built it so that pressure could still exist. He wasn't naive enough to think institutional pressure could be engineered away entirely, but so that the pressure had nowhere to hide. Every place where someone might be asked to quietly accommodate a business need at the expense of a safety standard was now a place where that accommodation had to be documented. The documentation was the accountability. The accountability was the whole point. Sophia reviewed the final system design in February and asked 3 questions, all of them good, and then signed off with the particular efficiency of someone who trusted the work. One thing, she said before he left, I want an annual external audit, not internal. Outside firm, different each year, no relationship to our vendors or contractors. I was going to propose that, he said. I know, she said. I wanted to say it first for once. He looked at her. Something in her face was lighter than it had been in October. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register to someone who hadn't been watching. But he'd been watching. There was a quality she'd had when he first started seeing her outside the professional context, something tightly held, a person always slightly at an angle to her own life. That quality hadn't gone, but it had shifted. It was less constant. There were stretches now where she was just present, where the proving and the managing and the perpetual peripheral self-awareness weren't running. He thought she was probably the same for him, from the outside. The system launched in March. 2 facilities had minor compliance issues in the first quarter. Not falsification, just old habits around documentation speed that required retraining. Ryan handled both personally, which was not strictly his job description, but which he believed was necessary for the first cycle. The third quarter ran clean. By year's end, the regulatory body that had opened the inquiry issued a formal acknowledgement of compliance restoration across all 7 Whitmore properties, which was the kind of document that didn't make newspapers but that meant something to the people it mattered to. Ryan framed it. He put it in his office, on the wall to the left of the window that looked out over the yard. Lily, when she saw it the one time she came to the facility for the annual family open day in October, studied it for a long time with the serious expression she brought to text she was trying to understand. "What does compliance restoration mean?" she asked. "It means we fixed what was broken, improved it," he said. She nodded slowly. "And you did that?" "Lots of people did it," he said. "I helped." She looked at the framed document again. "They should put more names on it," she said. He looked at it. "Yeah," he said. "They should." There is something people don't tell you about the aftermath of a crisis, about the long space that follows once the immediate danger has passed, and the investigations are complete, and the systems are rebuilt, and the dust has settled. People assume the hardest part is the crisis itself, and in some ways they're right, because the crisis has an intensity that focuses everything, that burns away the non-essential and leaves only what matters. But the aftermath is where you find out who you actually are, because the crisis gives you a role to play. It tells you what to do, where to stand, what the stakes are. The aftermath gives you nothing. It gives you ordinary Tuesday mornings and bad break room coffee and a floor to walk twice a day and a daughter who needs help with a school project about tectonic plates. It gives you a relationship that's building without a blueprint in the way real things build, incrementally, imperfectly, with setbacks and misunderstandings, and the occasional dinner where neither of you is fully present and you both know it and you agree, implicitly, to try again next time. It gives you the long, undramatic work of becoming someone. Ryan understood, in the year that followed the crane collapse, that he had been doing a version of this for 4 years without fully recognizing it. He had been protecting himself from loss by refusing to be someone who had anything left to lose, which was a reasonable response to what had happened and which had kept him functional and present and available to Lily when she needed him. He did not regret it, but he could see it now the way you can see a path you've walked after you've turned around, the shape of it, how it curved, what it was responding to. He had been, for 4 years, building a life that was designed to sustain but not to grow. And then a blind date had put him across a table from the one person who shared both his language and his wound, not identically, because wounds are never identical, but in a way that made conversation possible without translation. And then a crane had almost failed and hadn't, and a system had almost buried the truth and hadn't, and somewhere in all of that he had found himself doing the work he was trained for, in the place he was at, with the people who were in front of him. That was the thing, really. The thing that was hardest to articulate and most true. You didn't get to choose the moment. You didn't get to choose when the thing you'd been protecting yourself from came back around and asked you to be ready. You just got to decide what you did when it arrived. In April, Ryan and Sophia went back to Oleander. Not for any particular occasion. That was the point of it, actually, that it was a regular Thursday with no occasion attached, which was different from the first time and different from the second time, and which meant something that Ryan would have been unable to articulate specifically, but felt with clarity. They were seated at a different table this time, not the corner table. That one was taken by a couple who appeared to be on an early first date, cautious and slightly formal. And Ryan noticed them when he sat down and noticed the particular careful energy between them and did not say anything about it. Sophia looked at the menu with the ease of someone who had been here enough times that the menu was old information. She ordered the salmon without deliberating. He ordered it too because she'd been right the first time, and he saw no reason to change a good decision. The wine came. The bread came. The restaurant was warm and unhurried the way it always was. Pete Sorensen's team passed the Q1 audit, Ryan said, because he'd gotten the report that afternoon, and it was genuinely good news. I saw, Sophia said. You sent me the summary. With the footnote about the Bay 3 documentation issue, which you resolved before the audit finished. Right. He looked at his water glass. I'm just saying, the system works. She looked at him with the expression that was somewhere between amused and fond that she'd developed over the past months and that he'd stopped trying to categorize. You're telling me about work at dinner. You tell me about work at dinner constantly. That's my company, she said. The audit system is my system. She tilted her head in the way she did when she was acknowledging a point she didn't want to fully concede. Fine. Equal footing. That's all I'm asking for. She smiled. The real one, not the polished one. He could tell the difference now, which had taken longer than he expected and which he found he was glad about. That the difference existed, that it was distinguishable, that she didn't perform the real one but let it appear when it wanted to. The salmon arrived. It was as good as it had always been. Outside, the city was doing its April thing. The air turned soft after the long winter. People on the sidewalk moving with the slightly lighter quality of a population that had survived another cold season and was feeling the fact of it. Ryan could see it through the front windows, the street moving under the restaurant lights. He thought about the version of himself who had driven to this restaurant 14 months ago, hands at 10 and 2, running the quiet internal monologue of a man preparing to do something that had felt impossible. To be a person, for one evening, outside the walls he'd built. He thought about what he'd expected and what he'd found instead. He thought about how often those two things had been different in his life, what he'd expected and what had actually arrived, and how he had, for a long time, responded to that difference by trying to narrow his expectations until there was nothing left to be wrong about. He didn't want to do that anymore. That was the simple version. He didn't want to do that anymore, and not doing it was not a decision you made once, but one you made repeatedly, in small ways, every day. Choosing the open window instead of the additional brick. I've been thinking, he said. Sophia looked up from her salmon. Lily's spring break is in 3 weeks, he said. She wants to go somewhere with an aquarium. She has strong opinions about what constitutes an adequate cephalopod exhibit. Sophia set down her fork. Adequate cephalopod exhibit, she said. That's a specific requirement. She's a specific person. A moment. Sophia held her wine glass with both hands, looking at him with the particular attention she gave to things that were being offered rather than stated. Are you asking if I want to come? He looked at her. Outside, the city moved. The restaurant hummed quietly around them. The candle on the table between them, different table, same kind of candle, burned without wavering. I'm asking if you want to come, he said. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her running something. Not calculation exactly, more like listening to herself, which was something he'd watched her get better at over the past months. The small practice of actually consulting her own instincts before her executive function overrode them. Yes, she said, I want to come. He nodded. She picked up her fork. He picked up his. They ate dinner in the unhurried way of people who have time for this, who have built, between them and alongside their own separate lives, a space that is not urgent but is real, that does not require performance, does not need to prove anything, that is made of ordinary things accumulated and held. There are people who spend their whole lives looking for the extraordinary, the moment of transformation, the single decision that changes everything, the dramatic turn that separates before from after. Ryan had been one of those people without knowing it, in the early years expecting that grief had to be conquered before living could resume, that safety had to be guaranteed before risk could be taken, that loss had to be fully understood before it could be left behind. He knew now that it didn't work that way, that the ordinary was where the actual living happened, that you didn't finish grieving and then start building. You built while still grieving, imperfectly, with the grief present in the background like weather. That the wall was never going to come all the way down, and that was okay, because walls that come all the way down weren't walls anymore. They were rubble, and you couldn't live in rubble. What you could do was build a window in it, put a chair in front of the window, let some light in. He had a daughter who drew anglerfish with scientific accuracy and woke up every morning fully present and asked direct questions and had told a billionaire CEO that the giant isopod was a good answer with the authority of someone whose opinion was worth having. He had a job that used what he knew to protect people who needed protecting, and a structure designed to last past the people who built it, which was the only kind of structure worth building. He had a woman across a dinner table who had spent her whole career proving herself to people who were looking for reasons to doubt her, and who had finally, in the particular long aftermath of an ordinary crisis on an ordinary Saturday, stopped building her life entirely around the proof. They weren't the people they'd been when they walked into this restaurant the first time. They were the people who had walked through the year that followed, the investigations and the board meetings and the regulatory testimony, and the Sunday evenings, and the pancake brunches, and the Thai restaurant with the good curry, and the evenings where one of them wasn't quite present, and they tried again the next time. They were, in the specific and limited and deeply human sense of the word, okay. More than okay. They were here. They had earned the table, the salmon, the unhurried evening, the city moving outside. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. Ryan Carter, 33 years old, single father, structural engineer, regional safety director, a man who had spent 4 years being very careful and who was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be something more than careful, looked across the table at the woman who had become the most honest conversation he'd had since he stopped having them, and thought, this is what it looks like when something holds. Not perfect, not complete, not sealed against everything that could still go wrong. Just real, just present, just two people who had chosen each other, without guarantees, without a blueprint, in the ordinary and sufficient and irreplaceable way that people choose each other when they're finally done choosing fear instead. Outside, the city moved. The April air was soft. Somewhere across town, Lily was at Mrs. Albrecht's, probably drawing something in her sketchbook, probably a deep-sea creature that nobody else in second grade had thought to draw. And here, in a restaurant on 5th Street that smelled of good food and candle wax and the particular warmth of people being in the same place on purpose, two imperfect people had a real dinner and talked about ordinary things and let the evening be exactly what it was, which was everything.